I'm calling us to order, and I'm going to call the roll. Anna Gersh.
Here.
Anna Lemler. Kaz, I know, is absent tonight. Dwight Wilson. Graydon Crapel, I know, has to be absent. Janet Haynes.
Here.
Lauren Tatarski.
Here.
Lori Saginaw, here. Marquand Kane. Monica Harold.
Here.
Oh, here's Dwight. Munira Harrison. Rich Friedman.
Here.
Dick Sobel.
Here.
Robin Stevens. Sumi.
Here.
Yay. Okay. We have a buffet table for all of you good people. So there's a series of stacks that you can help yourself to. I have an important announcement that is related to housekeeping. The CTN staff, who have been so accommodating of us and will allow us to end at any time of the night, although we plan to end at 10, would ask us please to not bring food and drink into the studio unless it's a water bottle or a closed water bottle. There was a spill of a pop can last meeting that was problematic for the wiring and such. The other thing is that the door is locked but can always be opened by a buzzer, and there's always a staff person to allow anyone to enter at any time. And then thirdly, smoking is, I guess by law, 20 feet from the entrance to anyone who needs to have a smoke. Okay. The minutes for the last meeting. Are there any changes that anyone would like to make to them? Everybody was sent copies and has a copy. It's a nice account of what we did last time, which was a lot. No changes? Can I have a motion to approve? Great, thank you. All right, the agenda for tonight. Are there any motions to change the agenda in any way? All right, we'll go forward then. I've been starting every meeting with a summary of our work, and I appreciate that many of you have been to previous meetings and some of you are new. So, and for those in the television viewing audience, we're a volunteer task force. We were created by a resolution by Ann Arbor City Council that was passed in February of this year. There are 11 community seats, each given one vote. One of the 11 is designated for a youth, and that seat is currently occupied by 3 youths. It's a crowded seat that constitutes one vote. Tonight, we do not have any of our extraordinary youth members present, but we appreciate them. And then there are 2 additional seats on the task force for city council representatives who are non-voting, and they are also liaisons from the Human Rights Commission, and they are Sumi and Graydon, and we have appreciated them. Every member of this task force has agreed to work as a collective to recommend the scope and functions of a future community policing commission. The template that you have in your hands, it's nice and fat. It has yellow highlights on it, is our roadmap, and it touches on every aspect of the future commission that council's resolution outlined for us to address. In both writing the template and in revising it, we have considered best practices of existing bodies, such as the one we envision, the recommendations of experts, the community's expressed needs, what we've learned from the Ann Arbor Police Department, and municipal, state, and federal laws and agreements. You have the entire updated template with the edits that have been adopted and suggested at the time it was printed, which I believe was today. Hot off the press. Tonight's agenda indicates an ambitious goal to discuss the biggest chunk of Article 3, Incident Review, Article 4, Operation and Support, and Article 2, Composition. Any parts not discussed tonight can carry over to the next meeting, which will be August the 22nd. Thank you. Whatever is adopted tonight will be shown on the Google Doc that can be reviewed using the link on Legistar or on our Facebook page. Including tonight, there are 3 remaining meetings. On August 30th, the task force will vote on a final version of the document that we then submit to City Administrator Lazarus. Following that, there will be one additional public meeting when he presents his recommended changes to our document, and that date is to be determined in September. He has also asked City Council to consider making the commission the topic of its September work session, when both our document and his recommendations will be co-presented to City Council. No voting occurs at a work session. City Council will make all decisions about the final version to be adopted.
Do we already know the date of that?
We do not.
Can we hear what the question was?
Oh, I asked
We
if
know
we
the
already-
date.
Okay.
Council's objective in giving us this task and the timeline under which we've been working was to let candidates know what the expectations, candidates for the chief position, know what the expectations of such a commission would be in relation to that job, and to have a commission that would be involved in the hiring of the new chief. The hope was to have a commission in place by the end of the year. We now recognize that the process of outreach for applications and nominations to this future commission must be given enough time that the most appropriate representatives can be identified and given the time to apply. Significant efforts to educate the community about the commission are all needed in order to generate applications for this commission and its advisory council, who will meet all the qualifications that we will discuss in Article 2. Because we know this is a critical part of the commission's formation and that this kind of effort requires time for community engagement, and since we don't want it to be compromised, it is being considered that task force members, along with other members of the community, will be involved in the chief selection process. Our document is aspirational to give the future commission a solid role to address a system that can benefit from change and improvement. In this focus we're bringing to the work we're doing together, we are imagining how our commission could work for the betterment of the community as a whole, and most significantly, for its most vulnerable members. I want to thank the tireless efforts of activists and community members who continue to share their beliefs and ideas with us, and you who faithfully attend these meetings and watch on CTN. And I should every time, but I must do it tonight, recognize and appreciate each member of this task force for dedicating hundreds more hours than ever anticipated, both exciting and stressful, to this important endeavor. You can email us at Police Task Force, all lowercase, all connected, no punctuation, at a2gov.org and get information on our Facebook page. If you are unable to download and print anything, you can contact me at that address.
email goes to one of the chairs or both of the chairs, who mans the email?
It goes to all of us.
It goes to everyone,
Oh,
and
everyone.
I respond. Okay. In your agenda packet, I already pointed out that you have the template updated. You can see that things are crossed out, things are highlighted. This is what we're going to use as our map tonight. You also have a copy of the minutes of last meeting, August the 2nd. You have the official agenda for the night with the city's seal. And you have two other pieces of information that the task force was sent that pertain to Article 2. And they are from a collective of different activist groups in the community who will, I expect we will hear from tonight. Okay. We're going to start with what we placed in the parking lot at the last meeting. And we're going to begin, so this is going to require some navigating. We're going to begin on page 11. It looks like this, with a big chunk of yellow at the top. The page number is in the bottom left corner of every page. So this is what was placed in the parking lot. The way we're going to do this is that I'm going to read it with its updated revisions. The task force is going to discuss it, and then after a section has been discussed, we would like public comment on that section. And Janet is going to facilitate that for us. You'll note that there's a little green 1. So the number of this section is now 3.1.2. It used to be 3.3.2. And that was a change that we made at the last meeting. All it means is that this section is going to come first in the section that describes the responsibilities and powers of the commission. So the first portion under responsibilities and powers will be incident review. Initiation of review. Any person, whether or not involved in the incident in question, and without respect to citizenship or residence, may file a complaint, and may do so in any manner, orally or in writing. The commission shall not inquire about any complainant's immigration status. The commission shall facilitate initiation of review by providing an email address, a website, a telephone number, and a mailing address for initiation of review. It shall post on an easily accessible website a simple complaint form that may be completed online or printed out and mailed to the commission. A provision will be made for persons who are visually impaired and for non-English speakers. Paper copies of the complaint form shall also be available on request at the city clerk's office and at each office of the AAPD. The commission shall consider maintaining a city hall kiosk with paper copies of the form and a computer for purposes of filing complaints. City officers or employees receiving a complaint shall forward it promptly to the commission, but the complainant may in any event choose to send it to the commission personally. All officers and other employees of the AAPD shall be responsible for being informed about the complaint process and shall be responsible for providing complete and accurate information to any person who asks about how to file a complaint. City employees shall be instructed that they must not discourage any person from filing a complaint. The commission shall also seek to make copies of the complaint form available at each branch of the Ann Arbor District Library, at community centers around the city, and at other locations identified as convenient by the community. The form shall be offered only for convenience and shall not be required to file a complaint. The commission itself may also initiate review of an incident. Then flip the page. (3.1.3) Procedural choices in filing a complaint. When review of an incident is initiated by the filing of a complaint, the complainant shall have the following procedural choices. A, choice as to anonymity. The complainant shall choose to file the complaint anonymously or not. If the complainant files the complaint anonymously, the commission shall proceed to act on the complaint without attempting to determine the identity of the complainant, and it shall attempt to communicate with the complainant only if it can be sure of doing so without learning the complainant's identity. If the complaint is made without revealing the identity of the complainant, the commission shall presume that it is made anonymously. B, choices as to disclosure of the complaint. The complainant shall choose whether the complaint shall be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department. And if the complainant decides in the affirmative, and if the complainant decides in the affirmative, whether the complaint shall also be disclosed to the public. In essence, the complainant shall answer these questions. Do you want the police to know about this complaint? Do you want the public to know about it? If the complainant decides that the complaint shall not be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department, or shall be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department, but not to the public, the complainant shall be referred to as under seal. The commission and its agents, and in the case of a complaint disclosed to the city and its agent, shall take care, to the extent permitted by law, to ensure a complaint filed under seal shall not be disclosed contrary to the complainant's decision, provided that in the report provided for in Article 3232, the commission shall state the number of complaints so filed in the past reporting period. If the complainant decides that the complaint shall not be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department, the commission shall nevertheless investigate the matter to the extent it can do so without making such disclosure, such as by gathering information from the complainant, from willing third parties, and from publicly available sources, and as in other cases, shall be able to use any information it learns in making policy recommendations and may advise the complainant as to other steps the complainant may take. C, this is on page 13. Choices as to the disclosure of identity. If the complaint is not filed anonymously and the complainant decides that the complaint shall be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department, the complainant shall choose whether the complainant's identity shall also be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department. If the complainant decides in the affirmative and the complainant has also decided that the complaint shall be disclosed to the public, the complainant shall choose whether the complainant's identity shall also be disclosed to the public. In essence, the complainant shall answer these questions. Do you want the police to know that you are the person who filed the complaint? Do you want the public to know that? If the complainant decides that the complainant's identity shall be disclosed to the public, the complaint shall be referred to as open. If the complaint is filed openly, the complainant will have the option of appearing before the commission or the members of the committee designated to act on the complaint at a public session, and the commission shall make no attempt to conceal the identity of the complainant. If the complainant decides that the complainant's identity shall not be disclosed to the AAPD, or that it shall be disclosed to the AAPD but not to the public, then the complainant shall be referred to as confidential. If a complaint is filed confidentially, the complainant will have the option of appearing before the commission or the members of committee designated to act on the complaint at a closed session. And the commission, and in the case in which identity has been disclosed to the AAPD, the city, and the agents of both shall take care, to the extent permitted by law, not to disclose, contrary to the complainant's decision, the identity of the complainant or information that would facilitate discovery of the identity of the complainant, until such time as the complainant clearly indicates intention to file the complaint openly. The commission shall presume that a complaint is filed confidentially with intent that the complainant's identity not be revealed to the AAPD. The complaint form made available shall assure the complainant that before any action is taken on the complaint will, if the complaint is not anonymous, have an opportunity to discuss choices as to how to proceed with a member or representative of the commission, and that until then, the complainant's identity shall be treated as anonymous. However a complaint is filed, wrong emphasis. However a complaint is filed, a member or representative of the commission shall attempt promptly to communicate with the complainant, taking care in case of a complaint filed anonymously not to determine the identity of the complainant, to acknowledge receipt of the complaint, explain the complainant's options and procedural consequences, and ascertain the complainant's choices. A complainant who decides at one time that a given disclosure shall not be made may decide at a later time that the disclosure shall be made. The commission maintains contact with the complainant throughout the review process, informing the complainant as to progress and explaining options on how to proceed. The commission shall, where it deems appropriate, offer to retain the services of an advocate who would assist the complainant throughout the review process. The commission shall develop a system for classifying complaints by the type of misconduct alleged, and in the report provided for in Article 3.2.3.2, the commission shall state the number of complaints filed in the past reporting period alleging each type of misconduct. One more thing on page 15, and then we will discuss it as a big chunk. 3.1.4, time for initiation of review. There is no time limit for filing a complaint or for initiation of review of an incident. The commission will exercise appropriate caution in trying to determine the facts of an incident that is no longer recent, but it shall act on the recognition that no matter how old an incident is, it may hold lessons for the future. Okay, task force.
So I believe the way that it's written in the TJW document, which I kind of had thought we had adopted, but it's not so clear here. So I think the suggestion was to have the form, the submission of the claim, literally just say I'm submitting a complaint, and here's my complaint, and yes, I want it to be anonymous, or no, I don't want it to be anonymous. And then what would happen was the commission would take that if they want it to be anonymous, to decide whether how they're going to handle it just between the police and them, collecting it as data, using it to inform policy, or to, if it's not anonymous, then going through these steps by, you know, contacting the person, the complainant, and then talking through their options, which include, do you want the police to know about this? Do you want the public to know about it? Partly because someone submitting a complaint may or may not know the implications of those kinds of things. So answering those questions is like jumping ahead of the game. Whereas if they were to meet with a commission member and a victim advocate, then there's an opportunity to talk about, here are your options. You submitted a complaint, you didn't want it to be anonymous. Let's talk about what this looks like, including whether or not you want the police to know, including whether or not you want the public to know, and going from there.
I'm sorry, could I pause for a sec? Sam, I'm really sorry, but we've been asked to not have open pop cans in the studio.
Can I leave it outside and then get it after the meeting?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Just not in the studio, thank you.
So where's the studio at?
The door,
The hallway.
the hallway.
I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'm sorry, Lauren.
No, that's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is meant to adopt that idea. I mean, it gives the choices for how to file, but then if you look at the last paragraph on page 13, the complaint form shall assure the complainant that before any action is taken on the complainant, if not an anonymous complainant, will have an opportunity to discuss choices as to how to proceed, and that until then the complainant's identity shall be treated as anonymous. And then the representative or member or representative shall attempt promptly to communicate with the complainant and explain the choices. Okay. Now the commission may decide that on the complaint it's reasonable enough to ask for a preliminary indication of which way the person wants to go, but until the way this is drafted, until the complainant speaks to a member of the commission or representative, it's treated as anonymous.
Okay, so is there a way to make it more explicit that like those questions come like after the submission, the complaint is submitted? Like in 3.1.3 letter B, is there a way to say letter A is all that's included basically in the form, and then letter B is where the actual like communication with the commission member begins?
I'm a little reluctant to prescribe too carefully what should actually go in the form. I think maybe the commission should figure that out. I mean,
I guess, except that I understand that, except that I do think like this is a particularly sensitive situation, and that like just like we're making all recommendations, this would be something I think we should make a recommendation about, considering that
So-
it is it's like a victim-centered issue.
So
or
what's the
complainant-centered issue.
specific recommendation?
To make it clear that letter A is basically all that's included in the form. That here's my complaint, and I would like to remain anonymous or not. And then all the other things in this list, beginning at letter B, begin the process where either if it's not anonymous, then we contact the person, we ask them, do you want this? You know, becomes a conversation with the commission member and an advocate talking through all these other choices at that point. So just making that more explicit so that we are making the recommendation that the complainant does not have to understand the complexities of all of this when they submit the complaint.
I like that. Other comments?
It sounds a little
After
like
Anna.
an issue for the supplemental report, like recommendations around style and approach.
Forms. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be easy to say in here, the initial complaint submission includes A. The follow-up includes B onward. Because I do think, again, I think it's more important than just a suggestion. I think it's determinative of a complainant-centered procedure.
Dick?
I agree with the sentiment. I'm neutral as to whether it should go here or in the report, let the commission decide. But I think that the sentiment is, I agree with. I have a question about the contacting of the anonymous complainant. We have a provision, and we all support anonymity, and continually allowing choice to be made by the complainant. But it is important, or at least this section suggests that it's important that in certain circumstances that we contact the anonymous person without trying to identify who they are. I just don't know how that's done. I'm confused as to what process one would use to contact somebody but not learn their identity.
We're old, and, which you know.
Motion to strike.
Yeah, that was added in response to a suggestion from a member of the public several meetings back that there may be a technological way in which somebody could file something anonymously and there would be a way of communicating anonymously with that person without disclosing the identity. What do I know? You know?
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the idea. If the commission can develop such a way, then possibly. I mean, if we want to, I suppose we could add.
Are the Russians involved in this?
I don't know. I'm inclined to think it should go more in report, but we could say the complaint form made available pursuant to section 3.1.2 shall ask only for a choice as to anonymity and shall and assure the da-da-da. I mean, if the task force wants that, it's an easy enough fix to make. I personally, I think it's overprescribed, but I don't want to take time on it.
The da-da-da is the process, right? Is that what you're saying? The next steps?
And shall assure the complaint that before any action is taken on the complainant will. Here, I'm saying that a way to incorporate that would be in the last paragraph on 13, page 13. It says the complaint form made available pursuant to, squiggle, by the way, is section. Sometimes we say article, sometimes section, but pursuant to section 3.1.2 shall, I'm suggesting we could add the words ask only for a choice as to anonymity and shall, and then it goes on, assure the complainant that. That would I mean, Lauren wanted explicitness, so that would be explicit.
Any other comments about that? I remember being impressed with the importance of continuous consent, of having the opportunity for a complainant to have the opportunity at every step of the process to be offered a range of choices and to fully understand the consequences and the ramifications of all those choices. And I feel like that is contained here.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Page 14, first full paragraph,
So
second sentence.
I wonder about maybe putting it first. Because if it's under choices as
Where are you?
or at least in the first paragraph of B. So Rich is referring to the top of page 14, the first paragraph, first full paragraph,
Yeah.
as being the way of ensuring a continuous consent process.
Yeah, and if I can suggest, it may have been a typo. Instead of saying the commission maintains, I think it should say the commission shall maintain contact with the complainant throughout the review process, informing the complainant as to progress and explaining options how to proceed. If you like, we can make that sentence the very first sentence of the section. Just that sentence is the only one.
Commission shall where it deems appropriate.
Which sentence is that? The commission shall maintain?
Contact with the complainant throughout the review process, informing the complainant as to progress and explaining options
Okay.
how to proceed.
Does everybody follow that?
And putting that, the following sentence 2 about the advocate also up there?
I think that would be better where it is. Well, actually, now that was in brackets because we never really discussed the advocate. So
Okay,
that was
well,
a
that-
suggestion made that we never really discussed. But if people want it, I mean that
Can I make
that could go first too. If you want.
Okay.
So is the commission bound to follow this sequentially? Because that's what it seems like we're kind of picking over stuff. This needs to go first, this needs to go here. So is that because this is intended to happen sequentially?
I think the only argument I'm making is like what in the sequence, meaning like what is on the form, like what are people being asked before they really know anything about the implications of what they're being asked. Like let's make the form as simple as possible to get, and then have a conversation with the advocate, with the commission member about like what this all looks like, what the complaint process looks like, what their options are. And so they can ask questions, we can explain stuff. So I'm just trying to say, can we make that difference explicit?
And Anna, did you want to respond?
No, go ahead and finish this part. And then
I was, in response to your specific question, Monica, I think it really is a matter of sequence or chronology, because it's about meeting with the complainant and explaining this is what the process is going to be like. You may have an advocate if you need it, and then to go on and actually educate about the options, the ramifications, the process. So I would say yes, it is about a sequence.
Thank you.
Are there other things that the task force would like to add or change to this section before we go to public comment?
I guess we should talk about the advocate then, if we haven't decided on having that part in there.
the parentheses.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's talk about the advocate.
I think there should be one. No, it should be in here.
I unite with that. My guess is, let's say if all of my immediate relatives lived in town, at least a few of them would ask for me to be the advocate. And I would take on that responsibility.
So by saying advocate, it could be a personal support individual, or it could be, my understanding was that there are professional advocates who are trained to accompany,
Safe House has them.
a person. So it could be either. But does that need to be
Explicit.
explicit, or is it?
Yeah, I would imagine that this probably has implications for the budget. And thinking about if we were to have an advocate, if we wanted to make an advocate that is available to people, that they would be compensated through the city or through, whatever budget the commission has.
And you said that Safe House has them?
Yes,
The organizations have.
but they're on the payroll too.
So are you suggesting a professional or personal?
Do we have to specify?
No, I don't think we have to specify.
You don't think we have to?
Yeah, that's probably a logistical thing, I think.
Okay.
The commission can identify.
I did note that that TJW had suggested throughout the last sentence, the services of an advocate who would assist the complainant throughout the review and examination process. And I wasn't sure about
why it was taken out, the examination process?
Well,
or no?
what the, yeah, if we need to include that, if it's already included by review.
I think review process is the whole thing. So I think this is all encompassing. I mean, the title of the whole section is incident review.
Okay. So it's already included.
That's,
Any other comments?
I have one last thought for me, at least, which is that we don't actually like say the word consent in here, I don't think. So I think it might be important to kind of use, explicitly say that the commission is receiving consent and asking for consent along every step of the process or something. Because, clearly that's kind of what it's designed to do, but we're not explicitly saying like all of these points are going to get consent and we're going to ask consent for. And I'm not seeing that. I don't know if I'm missing it, but.
it does say the complainant shall choose, and if the complainant decides, it's all that these are all decisions made by the complainant. And then it says, a complainant decides at one time that a given disclosure shall not be made, may decide at a later time that the disclosure shall be made. I think it's a stronger term than consent. I think it's saying that the complainant has the choices, and that's stated explicitly also in what had been the first sentence. When review is initiated by filing of a complaint, the complainant shall have the following procedural choices. I think it's stronger than speaking of consent. It's saying that the complainant is the master of the whole thing, deciding how it goes.
One suggestion would be, because I felt that the memo that we received about sexual misconduct was based on professional protocols. So one idea would be to add at the end of the sentence, right before the commission shall, where it deems appropriate, offer to retain the services of an advocate. If we were to add, the commission shall maintain contact with the complainant throughout the review process, informing the complainant as to progress and explaining options on how to proceed, comma, and the implications of every option in a process of continuous consent.
Did you write
It's
that
like
in the Google Doc or no?
No, I just wrote it in the column.
And we
Okay.
could say
It's
of like
not-
informed consent, continuous informed consent.
Sure. Continuous informed consent.
Could you read that again?
The commission shall maintain contact with the complainant throughout the review process, informing the complainant as to progress and explaining options on how to proceed and the implications of every option in a process of continuous informed consent.
Great. I think that's encompassing of all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
One last question. How does the task force feel about the adding to alleging each type of misconduct, listing examples of misconduct, such as the full range of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, acts or threats of retaliation, unnecessary or excessive force, inappropriate language or conduct, discrimination, failure to wear or display required identification, or failure to identify by name or badge when asked by a civilian.
What page?
This is not on a page. I'm just suggesting this because this was in a suggestion that we received. Yes.
A couple of observations. One is, whenever you create a list, it's what's not on the list. And if someone doesn't feel they fit into a particular list, they may be discouraged from applying because it's not listed. The other issue is that what we're saying to folks is that if, to put it in the simplest terms, if you think you've had a problem with the police of any type, then here's a complaint form. There's no pre-selection process. It's just whatever you feel, and there's a whole range of how you could apply. So I would suggest that we stick with the complainant making the decision, and not have him or her have to decide whether they fit within a box that we've said is an example.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't trust lists.
I have the same orientation.
Good, I'm glad I asked. Okay, guess what? It's public comment time. Janet Haynes?
Can I
Oh,
ask
yeah,
a question
sure.
about public comment in terms of how we're listed here? As I looked at it, we were going to discuss 3.1.2
Right.
through 3.1.9 as the commission, and then have public comment. Are we doing it a different way?
You know what? You are absolutely right. I am
Those will end up having,
deviating from the agenda.
by accident or intentionally? My only question is that we're going to have two public comments, one after we do the second part, or just one? It's listed on the agenda as just one.
Well, is there public comment on this section?
No. This is, I really think
We
that-
should keep going?
Yes, I think so too.
All right. Okay, we'll keep going.
Yes.
No, you will.
You will at the
It's in the
end,
agenda.
end of this.
The agenda says there's public comment, but. No, at
No.
the end of the section we're talking
At
about.
the end of the section.
Oh, go ahead, you're the chair.
No, that's all right.
The agenda says that we will have public comment after we finish discussing 3.1.2 through 3.19. Then we have public comment. And then we have a whole series of sections that we're going through, and after a chunk of a section, we have public comment. That's all. It's in the agenda. You have public comment, but it's after this next section.
So we're going to continue on the bottom of page 15, 3.1.5, squiggle 3.1.5, referral of matter to police chief. If the complainant decides that the complaint should be disclosed to the Ann Arbor Police Department, the commission shall promptly refer the matter to the police chief for a report. And if the commission decides on its own initiative to review an incident, it may make such a referral, provided that, to the extent the complaint or inquiry concerns conduct of the police chief, the matter shall be referred to the city administrator. What you see at the top of page 16 is a proposed addition. And the proposal is that it be inserted at this point.
Who's this from?
What? What's the question, Anna?
Never mind, go ahead. I'll look at the document itself.
So section 3.1.5.1, protection against retaliation and intimidation. Retaliation, actual or threatened, or any form of intimidation against any complainant, witness, or other person involved in the incident review process, A, is expressly prohibited as a matter of city policy. B, shall be regarded as a separate and distinct incident, regardless of any action taken with respect to the underlying incident. And C, shall result in discipline up to and including termination of employment. When the AEPD informs an officer of a complaint as part of the disciplinary process, the AAPD shall reference these provisions. In addition, when a complainant appears to fear the possibility of retaliation or intimidation, the commission shall, assuming it is not obligated as a matter of law or for protection of the public to make a prompt report, discuss with the complainant and the complainant's advocate, if the complainant has one, the following possibilities, and shall proceed in the manner chosen by the complainant. A, proceeding with the complaint kept under seal pursuant of section 3.1.3. B, and not informing the AAPD about the complaint or the commission's interest in the matter. B, without transmitting the complaint to the police chief, requesting information and materials from the police chief about the incident. The AAPD shall not treat such a request as a complaint triggering the disciplinary process, but shall instead respond to it in the manner in which it responds to requests under the Freedom of Information Act, provided that no fee shall be imposed for producing such information and materials. And C, referring the complaint to the police chief pursuant of section 3.1.5, provided that if, pursuant of section 3.1.3C, the identity of the complainant is not disclosed to the AAPD, and the AAPD shall treat the complaint in the same manner as it treats complaints that it receives anonymously. Section 3.1.6, report to the police chief. If the commission refers a matter to the police chief for a report, the police chief shall report to the commission in writing, stating the police chief's determinations as to the facts of the incident, whether there was any inappropriate conduct by the police, any discipline that has been or will be imposed, and any changes in policies or procedures that ought to be made as a result of the incident. Except to the extent prohibited by federal or state law, the city charter, or a collective bargaining agreement, or to the extent protected by privilege or work product doctrine, the report shall include all documents related to the incident, including statements by the officers involved, all video evidence, and descriptions of any tangible evidence, provided that if the police chief believes that some information or materials related to the incident cannot be produced because of law or collective bargaining agreement, the police chief shall describe the information and materials withheld and state with particularity the reason why they cannot be produced. Documents and other materials shall be redacted only to the extent necessary. Where possible, dummy names such as victim or officer A shall be used rather than blacking out portions of a document. Section 3.1.7, timing of the report, an interim report. The police chief shall make the report required by section 3.1.6 within 30 days of receiving the referral under section 3.1.5, provided that if ongoing disciplinary or criminal proceedings or investigations preclude the police chief from making the report at that time, then the police chief shall make the report within 14 days after conclusion of those proceedings. And in extenuating circumstances explained in writing by the police chief, these time limits shall be extended, but only for a reasonable time. At any time, the police chief may make an interim report, and the police chief shall do so if unable to make a final report within 45 days of the referral. At the bottom of page 17, section 3.1.8, further information and discussion. At any time, before or after the police chief makes the report required by section 3.1.6, if the commission has information that it believes is material to consideration of an incident, it may pass that information on to the police chief. And if the commission believes that further information will be material to consideration of the incident, it shall ask the police chief to present that information. And if the information is in the possession of the Ann Arbor Police Department or could be secured by the Ann Arbor Police Department by reasonable efforts, the police chief will include that information in the report required by section 3.1.6 or in a supplemental report. After making the report required by section 3.1.6, the police shall, if either the police chief or the commission wishes, discuss the report in person with the commission. On page 18, section 3.1.9, confidential production, disputes concerning production. When production of information and materials is required by this ordinance, the production shall be made in confidence only if that is necessary by reason of law, collective bargaining agreement, or overriding public policy. Public policy considerations shall not in themselves excuse production of the materials and information, but may justify the production being made in confidence. Any disputes concerning the production of information and materials may be resolved pursuant of 4.10. Okay. Shall I read 4.10?
That's not on the
Okay.
agenda.
All right. Janet?
Well, do we have, task force members have any comments on the additional that was just read before we go to public comment?
I have one question, partly of the task force, partly of the city. And I'm asking this, and if you can give this information, fine. If you can't, it's fine too. Does the Ann Arbor Police Department have any internal, can you hear me? Does the Ann Arbor Police Department have any internal rules or procedures regarding anonymous complaints or rules against retaliation?
Yes.
Okay.
We have policy, internal policy, department policy, as well as city HR policy.
Dealing with both of those subjects?
Yes, specifically Ann Arbor police policy on anonymous complaints being filed, and then both department and city policy on retaliation.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else?
Just to clarify, the policy with respect to anonymous complaints is that that complaints may be filed and heard anonymously and may be pursued. And with respect to retaliation, my understanding is that their policies, I mean, maybe they're broad enough to cover this complaint process, but their policies with respect to harassment and with respect to discrimination, are they broader than that? The anti-retaliation policies? I wasn't sure. In any event, this states a policy against retaliation in the context of this proceeding. I'm not sure you have a policy against retaliation that's broad enough to cover this proceeding. Maybe the city attorney can tell us.
I think that would be an internal police. You're talking about a police complaint about retaliation by officers who have had a complaint made against them.
Yeah, I don't think it's spelled out in our complaint process policy.
Yeah.
But ours is broader.
This
and it clearly addresses the question.
Clearly addresses
Yeah.
this context.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I should say that the language of the first part of this was taken in large part from the city policies to which the chief is referring. It's just making it clearly applicable in this context.
Any other?
I just had a small question concerning something else. When you talk about the retaliation, either actual or threatened, there's something within me saying that we want to look at actual retaliation committed, threatened, and sometimes perceived, even if it's perceived retaliation. And in that, what I mean by if a complainant perceives that, for example, now the police are driving by their house regularly, it may not be that that's what's happening, but if there's a perceived threat, I think it's important for that to be considered as well.
As part of the retaliation.
Yes.
So,
So when you say retaliation committed, threatened, or perceived?
Well, I'm sorry, there's a bit of a problem there, which is that it says retaliation, actual, threatened, or intimidation is expressly prohibited as a matter of city policy. It's difficult to threaten, to prohibit the perception. Now, maybe what you want to say is, or action that could reasonably lead to the perception of intimidation, or threats. Would that satisfy?
I just want that if people perceive they're being retaliated against or they're being intimidated, that somehow that's dealt with.
Yeah.
Now, I'll leave the legal language to you guys.
Yeah.
As you're raising it, Monica, is your concern that if someone perceives it, they should be able to complain about it? They ought to be able to initiate a complaint, that this, I feel that I'm
But I'm
being-
assuming a complaint has been initiated already, because all of this is in reference to the complainant, things being done to the complainant. So I'm assuming that a complaint has already been made. So I guess in my thinking is that if a person has made a complaint, and as a result of that complaint, perhaps they're not under seal, they now perceive that they are being intimidated,
Right.
or there's retaliation by the police department, that somehow there's they have redress.
Yeah, right. You want this section to capture that they have a right to complain about that perception.
Yes.
Yeah.
So would an example be someone has made a complaint, they feel like now the police are driving by their house more, they're able then to go and say, I feel like, it seems like the police are driving by my house more often.
I mean, I think that's exactly what I said a few
Right.
minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean,
But I guess
I'm just trying to imagine what that,
There are other ways.
I'm just trying to imagine what it looks like,
that was
in the
just an
process.
example.
Yeah.
It could be so many ways.
That was
And
that
as-
was an excellent example.
And can I
here's
give an
another one.
example from something that we heard from the police department themselves? How there was an African American man driving, and he seemed like every time he turned, the police officer turned, the police
I was
officer
just
turned.
thinking of that piece
You
of
know,
video,
hi-
yeah.
and we're saying now this police officer wasn't doing that, but you will never convince that person that that was not happening to them. You would never convince me that that was not happening if every time I made a turn, the policeman was making a turn. So if a person has complained and suddenly this is happening, that might be a perceived intimidation or perceived retaliation move. So the language, the legal language of it, fine. I just wanted to get, say something about the fact that there are many times when people perceive that they are being threatened, and sometimes that perception is reality.
Absolutely. So can I suggest that we add language before the small a in parentheses after incident, any person involved in the incident review process, comma, or conduct that could reasonably be perceived as retaliatory, threatening, or intimidating. Good enough?
That's fine with me.
Okay.
I don't know what the rest of the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's valid. And also, let me just make clear that I think in response to what Hannah was, I'm not sure where it came from, but so the complaint's filed, and then there's suggestion that, hey, there's retaliation, intimidation, whatever. That can be a separate complaint or a supplemental complaint. Okay. In other words, because that itself is a separate and distinct incident.
That was my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can add to the complaint or make it separate, whatever. That's.
But that's just not about perceived, right? That's
about everything.
What I'm
It's
saying.
about
is
everything, yeah.
It seems that's written in for
It's
whether it's
perceived or
actual,
I think,
committed, or threatened, perceived.
I
It's not
think-
just for the perceived threat, right?
They say, well, they're doing something that's making me scared. And,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
they weren't having to do a separate complaint just
No,
because
they
they perceived.
don't have to. They can just add.
Yeah.
Anything else?
This is going back a little bit. 3.1.5 or even maybe before too, where I just want to revisit it. I know we've touched on this before.
Where are you at?
I'm pretty sure it's in a couple places, but 3.1.5 is where I'm looking. So just that this has been brought up a couple times by the community, that there could be a way of not going to the police chief for information, but having like a data ombudsman. I don't know how that word is. I don't know if I said it right.
Ombudsman.
Ombudsman, thank you. So I just wanted to revisit that. If there's a way that we can suggest that it wouldn't be directly to the police chief for getting information.
Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I think that there, I can't imagine, I mean, nobody's put forward how that would work. What in essence we're doing is having a layperson there having complete access to all records within the police department, being able to do what they feel is appropriate, being able to redact if they think it's appropriate, and engaging in information without the police knowing about it. And I think that's problematic. I think that my own sense is that the commission, there's a lot of what we're talking about which may well become critical as the commission develops over time. And that in the first year we're going to learn a lot about how this works. And that the commission is going to have the ability to go back to council and present problems, if we find them. That there is a problem here. We're not getting the information from the chief the way we thought we are. We're not getting the documents in the way we are. We don't trust the police, and here's the evidence of that. And therefore, we would make a recommendation, maybe yours or others, based on what we see for that time. But to put something like this in there now, I think it's problematic and premature, is my sense. And that I envision over the years that what we have now is going to change as we see evidence, as we hear feedback from the community, whether we're doing better or worse. This is an organic process of which we're trying to create the first image. And it's an imperfect image, because that's what you have when you create the first model. Anyway, that's...
I mean, I guess maybe if someone has been out there, is informed on that suggestion, you can share with us, because my impression is probably if it's something that they've suggested, that maybe it's been done before, that there's a way that I'm not informed about. But so if somebody wants to share that tonight, I would be interested in hearing if that's a process that we've seen before or can replicate.
I haven't seen it, and I think it's a very impractical idea, and for the reasons mentioned by Dick and others. I mean, so you have somebody who's got complete access to all the files in the police department. I don't know who that person is and who controls that person, but that person can take anything out without the police department knowing about it. So, I mean, that's, things have to be redacted, and they have to be redacted not only according to standards, but they have to be, it has to be redacted. Choices have to be made with respect to, is there an ongoing investigation? So it's impractical in the sense that if somebody's going to send something out of the police department, they're going to have to check, or they're either going to impair the police functioning by sending stuff out that bears on an ongoing investigation, or notify the police leadership that's happening anyway, which defeats the purpose. I think it's potentially dangerous also because, I believe this is, I'm sorry Robin isn't here, but I think this is what aroused her opposition, because it delays the knowledge of the police department in some cases as to where there is a miscreant, somebody who should be corrected. It also, it's not justified by anything we know about this police department. I mean, their response, obviously the reason for this commission is that we don't think that internal investigations are the be-all and end-all, and we're not going to just be satisfied with the conclusions that they draw. But it's very different to say, well, if we let the police chief know and we let professional standards know, the professional standards whose job it is to investigate complaints against the police, they're going to corrupt the evidence, or they're going to encourage retaliation. There's no suggestion of that in this police department. And I do want to say I think a lot of the impetus behind this relates to sexual misconduct. And the one case that we know of about sexual misconduct, I'm aware there may be more, it's the tip of the iceberg and all that, but the one case we know about, the police leadership was very aggressive in pursuing the complaint and And the officer was very quickly was gone from the department, and he was prosecuted and sent to jail. And the whole ethos of the department around that is that this is a bad guy. He should have gotten worse. You know. Also, I think it's not going to generate much anyway. If there's no investigation pending, then all it could be gotten would be stuff like the body, the camera evidence, which could be gotten otherwise anyway through a FOIA request, and can be gotten easily with what we're proposing. If there is an investigation going, then the police department know about it anyway, so they're not going to be terribly surprised by the commission's interest in it. I also want to emphasize how far we're going in giving the complainant choices and protection. We're saying, okay, you've come to the commission with a complaint. If you don't want us to let the police department know about it, we'll hold off. We won't do that unless law requires us to, which it might in some cases. Okay. If you want to we can go to the police department protecting your name, and they won't know who it is who's kept your name. And also, if you want, we can just inquire about this without a complaint. Just say, here's an incident we'd like to know whatever you have. This is not a complaint at this point. Give us what you have in the manner of a FOIA request. Not only without any name being mentioned, but without any complaint being issued. The only thing that we don't do that would suggest, which to my mind is just just way too far, is to have somebody not responsible, not part of the police administration, who's going to have access to all the information and somehow spirit it out without the police department knowing about it. I'd also, if this is going to be pursued, I think it would be helpful to hear from the city attorney and from the police leadership about it. Because I think it's impractical.
I would add also that, if you just think sort of broadly about work environments, that asking for that kind of behavior within an environment where you have to work with everybody, you have to have lunch with them, and live with them. You're really sort of creating an environment that fosters perverse incentives, that wants to well, maybe I'll give them a little bit of this, or I'm going to be friendly with the data ombudsman because I'm a little concerned about this situation getting out, and it seems vulnerable to perverse incentives.
So, I mean, as dangerous as you guys think that is, I think it's equally dangerous to trust someone who's running the police department to always want to be perfectly honest about all their documentation and all. Like, I think that has some equal dangers. Also, I think current leadership does not mean forever leadership. I just think it's a good thing to think about. Who are we asking information from, and how well are they connected to what they're doing and what we're asking information for? Pretty connected. And I think when we talk about power structures, it might be easy for someone like you and me to trust that the police chief is going to hand over information. I think history shows, relationship shows, community experience shows that historically and currently is challenging in power dynamics. So I think it's easy, again, for us to trust, like, that's our experience, and it's not the experience of people who find themselves more often in these situations. So I think it's just important, like, again, as dangerous as you think having someone else do it, I feel like it's, potentially equally as dangerous in trusting that, the police chief is forever trustable about this issue. It's good that it can be taken to city council. It's good that it can be FOIA'd. Again, then the commission's going to need money so that it can FOIA things.
Won't need money.
Oh, I thought FOIA costs money.
Not for the commission.
Not the way
Great.
it's
That's good. Okay, so it's just something I think
Okay.
it's not easy to just look
Anna,
past.
then Dick?
I'm curious, so what would that person, like, what kind of job would that be? What qualification would you get for, I'm just curious, like, how do you imagine this person to
Well, I think that's the thing, is a suggestion given by the community and put in a number of the templates we've received. And so I don't personally, maybe someone here will have some more information about it. Also, we as the task force could look into that. I think it's worth looking into another way of accessing information.
Dick?
Well, I agree with Laura that it's an idea. It's somewhat unformed, or at least for the moment. It can be mentioned in the report as something for future discussion, but for us to put that, for us to sort of vote on that now in its present unformed sense, I think would be premature, and on that point.
And I'm happy to
yeah.
investigate more about it and report back.
Okay.
Anyone else? I'd like to say that I have given it a lot of consideration. It was brought up to us. It was taken seriously. Rich and I have met extensively with the chief and the deputy chief, with the city attorney, with the city administrator, to look at whether this is possible. And Rich, I'm a witness to how thoroughly he probed to understand its feasibility and the implications of it. The problem that looms most to me is that it's based on an assumption that the leadership is going to be corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And
or is just
what,
based on
Lauren,
the chance that it
can
could be.
Okay.
Or what?
It's based on the chance that it could be, and so the commission should have all the tools it needs
and so
to make sure.
I look at the example of Jason Kitt, and I think about how that could have played out if the police department had not been immediately involved and active. So he was pulled off the street, he was put on leave, more witnesses were found because of the efforts of PSS. He was fired, he was put in jail. I hear what you're saying about access to information not being equitably possible. And that, to me, is the job of the commission, to balance that. The commission, in my mind, exists to work with the police department to get as much information as is possible for the complainant. So the flaw that I see in it is that it actually creates a huge liability for the commission and for the city by extension, because the commission is part of the city, and for the police department if something needs to be known by the department and that information is withheld.
But that's
so if
I mean, when you're done.
If something happens, if someone else is harmed as a result of them not having the information and acting on it, then it's the responsibility of the people who withheld the information.
So are you talking about the time between a complaint submission and not telling the police? Because this seems like a separate issue to me, having someone else who's not the police chief getting us the information.
Any information that is needed, the commission can get without revealing the name of the complainant.
Right.
But if it's a criminal act, or if it is an act that has the repercussions of Officer Kitt, then the department needs to be involved.
Okay, so I think that's a separate issue that I think we have worked through in here. I have to review that section, but what we're saying, what I'm trying to refer to is we shouldn't have to go to the police chief to get the information, right? That there would be someone designated who doesn't, belong to the police, or I don't know how this works, that would get the information so that there's there's a trust in that we're getting all the information and that we're getting the information that's available. So I hear your point, but I think it's different. I think it's really about where you have to go to get information from.
Okay.
Many in the audience have told us, either personally or to the task force, that one of their biggest complaints is that the police department is not transparent. When you ask them what policies or procedures or the basis of investigations, many of you feel that the police department have stonewalled you and you're not able to get information that you feel is important in order to evaluate whether something was done right. People on this task force have heard that from many different people. I can only say that when you read this document in its entirety, it stresses that the commission, and therefore the community, should have access to policies, practices, and investigations. And it develops many means by which that can occur. And for me, that is the heart of this commission, is to get that information so that there can be independent judgments made whether the police department is acting appropriately, either in one incident or we see trends that something's happening and we don't see the police department reacting to that. We now have information for which we can make reports public. This document, when read in its entirety, I believe gives the commission a lot of authority, if passed by City Council, gives the commission a lot of authority to gather information, not only to improve, to commend or recommend or to criticize the police, but more importantly to give everybody in this room and in the community information that in the past you felt has not been provided.
But this is just saying that to get that information, we rely on the police chief. Okay, you were going to say something.
Well, Rich, then Anna. Anna, Rich.
Right, so I think that when we're talking about the access to information, Lori, what I heard you saying was that wanting to make sure that the department is alerted to something very severe so that there would be consequences, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that what's important to remember in all of this is that if we're being victim-centered, then they would be able to have the option with informed consent, right? By informed consent, so they know the consequences, they know the process, to say, I want to alert the chief immediately, or I don't, right? So I think it's about giving options. That's what's victim-centered. The police chief could be notified if that is what is requested by the commission via the consent of the person who's been harmed. So, so I want to make that point because I think we're talking about access to information and then the alerting system, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's both and. It's that we need multiple venues and there is choice in when a person wants to, how quickly they want to make that kind of progress. I also just want to say that I don't think that this is making the assumption that the police are corrupt. I think that we know that institutions and systems are made up by individuals and that we all have bias and that an implicit bias, and we all behave with our implicit bias. And so I think it's important that, to me, this is just an accountability measure, and this is just a measure for actual transparency and also to be victim-centered. So I think I disagree with that narrative that this is about police being corrupt, and instead believe that it's a way to actually be more victim-centered and open. And I think too, we're noticing that we're hitting up against a wall, and that requires that we as a task force, and then also hopefully the future of the commission, just like you said, Dick, is that potentially in years to come we can envision what would that actually look like. So I think that it's an important tool that should be accessible that isn't necessarily right now.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thank you.
I think the concern that this addresses is not one of implicit bias, because as Dick has emphasized, the way the draft goes, the commission is entitled to all the information. The only reason why you would say we're not going to tell the police chief is because there's concern that somehow the evidence is going to get corrupted or there's going to be an attempted retaliation. I mean, sure, we understand that a police chief, that professional standards, they may be biased to looking at events in a particular way in favor of police against complainants. That's why we need a commission. But what the draft says is when you get to the point where you're going to go and try to get information from out of the police department, you get it from the source, and you don't spirit it out of the department without the head of the department knowing it. I mean, imagine if there's an ongoing investigation and sensitive information is taken out of the department without the police chief knowing about it. I mean, for that matter, there's a possibility. I would think that bad folks could then just misuse the whole commission process as a way of finding out what the police have on them, because they're going to get this ombudsman to get information out. I mean, the whole thing can be gamed. Let's also bear in mind, if the whole thing is predicated on the idea of we don't want the police department leadership to know about this. Well, if they don't know about it, there's not going to be a whole lot of information that they have. There's the camera evidence. So, I mean, there's really no indication that the police chief is going to, there's a complaint about an officer and the police chief is going to say, before we hand that over, let's distort the camera evidence. It's not going to happen.
Well, I think
it's a high level. Wait, let me
that
finish.
definitely happens.
Okay, I don't think there's no indication that it's happened here. It's not. Well, of course it matters if it's local, because we're addressing this police department.
No, it's a much larger system of power in the country.
Let me finish. Okay. We're addressing this police department, and we got to say, okay, there's a possibility down the road of something happening. Now, look, if there's corruption on the part of the police chief, then that's something that the department can call to the attention of the commission, if necessary. The city council, the city administrator, if necessary, state police. But this basically takes away control of information within the police department to some ombudsman. And I wonder who.
Right, part of the danger of the power of the police is to have access to all that information and no one to intervene in that power.
Let me finish. The commission intervenes in that power by asking for the information and says, give us everything you have that bears on this incident. And the chief is obligated to give it, and the chief is obligated to come and answer questions. Okay? So and the ombudsman, I mean, if the ombudsman is independent from the police department, then it takes control of the police department away from the department itself. If the ombudsman is somehow affiliated with the police department, I'm not sure why somebody who's not trusting the police department is necessarily going to trust the ombudsman. It's a recipe. It's a recipe for disaster. I really believe that.
It's clear that we have different views on this as a task force. I know that there's public comment that is waiting to be made, and it looks to me like we have two people from the city who would also like to speak. Is that all true?
I'm standing up to give my back some rest, but I've told both you and Rich Friedman that I'm happy to talk about some of the things that you've said, and I'm happy to do it before or after the public speaks.
Well, let's have public comment first. Yeah.
So this is the time for public comment. We are allowing 10 minutes for this, inclusive, so. For all of us? Yes, for all, because we have a lot to do, and I know that this is a very important section, but 10 minutes, and stay with this topic, please.
So I have two things to bring up. One thing is not currently in the template. I'm wondering if there are more ways that we can make the complaint process accessible by having funding to offer things like transportation or childcare for people who wouldn't be able to meet with the commission without that, or for having things like the kinds of notes that people get for jury duty if people have to skip work and their work won't let them, if they have to if that's the only time the commission is able to meet with them. I think the more ways to enable meeting with the commission, the better, and I don't think these options have been as thoroughly thought out as they could be. I also want to respond to some things said about data and information. The first thing is assuming that the Ann Arbor Police Department is better than other police departments is really, really dangerous and kind of a really white assumption to make. That will lead to more people getting killed. you say that we have no reason to mistrust the police or the chief. If I had no reason to mistrust the police, I would be doing many better things than sitting here for 3 hours a week. That sucks. More ways to get information is better. We talked about toolbox strategies for information before. I think we should keep envisioning a toolbox, and the more options that are available to both the commission and the complainant, the better the process is. The question here is really one of agency. It's who has agency over information. It's whether the police chief has agency over the information that they're giving, or the commission has agency over the information that they're getting. And I think empowering the commission to have that agency is more powerful than just leaving it and ceding it to the police. And also, the police are allowed to surveil us all the time anyway. So, like, it's only fair that we would get to surveil them too.
Hello, just to follow up on that, I support empowering the commission as well. I also want to refer back to the list that was sent to Lori from a community member, and I think that it's taken us a long time to name things like sexual harassment and name calling, and I think that things like were listed in that list are important, and I think adding to it is important. And yes, of course, you always run the risk when you use a list of people and things being left out, but at least it's a trigger for people to think of if it's on a form. So I really support having a list that includes behavior, misconduct, like sexual misconduct.
I'm going to suggest a possible way of resolving the stark differences that have just emerged on this task force, and that is to look at best practices in other commissions to see how they resolve this particular difficulty. Because the way it's been framed on both sides seem unacceptable. To have somebody sneak into the police department and take out documents, or, you know, on the other hand, simply trust the police, in which case, why are we having a task force in the first place? The second thing that's been on my mind is I'm wondering about how anonymity can really be respected. Suppose I'm treated badly by a police officer and I come to the commission and I want to remain anonymous, but I also want that police officer disciplined. Okay, somehow that police officer has got to know what happened, what that incident was, on what day. And as soon as the police officer knows that, they know me, because they have my information. So how is that anonymity going to be really protected? Maybe it can't be, but I wouldn't want the public to believe that absolute anonymity is possible in that case.
Thank you.
Any others?
I just want to ask how many people still want to speak on this issue for the time that we have. My name is Peggy Clues. I'm really concerned about, is there anybody on this task force who's been arrested for anything other than a political act? And you only talk about a membership of maybe one person who has survived trauma. The kind of trauma that we're talking about probably doesn't really even, involve corruption. I'm telling you, the fact that you don't have that voice on this task force and it has to come out of here and we only have 10 minutes to find, that for everybody to decide, we don't even know each other. Okay, who's got the most important thing to say, right? How are we supposed to do that with? I could at least give my 2 minutes to somebody else or something. If we knew how many people there are who want to talk on this and where you're coming from, and can we, cover all of the academic arguments in an email and say, let's see, anybody been traumatized by the police here? Is this bullshit that we're hearing or what? So that's all I got to say. I really want to hear from other people too. It has more than one voice on the commission, by the way, or it's got no credibility whatsoever, because that one voice will always be drowned out by everybody else who doesn't know what it's like to be brutalized by the police and have them lie about you. I'm guaranteeing you, if you file a complaint about the police, they will have already filed a complaint that you accosted them first. You don't even know the reality that we're talking about. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I have a question first. My name is Shirley Beckley. If a complaint, now it's been my what I've known in the past is when you file a complaint, you don't talk to the police chief, and you talk to someone else, and they talk to the police chief. So first of all, I need to understand, is this commission going to be able to allow those of us that want to give a complaint, we may be able to talk, you may be able to talk to the police chief? Because I don't believe that's true, but maybe things have gotten better since I've had any dealings with the police. I just want you to understand, I understand you're the task force and you're setting up this commission. So it's the commission that's really that we're gonna have to work with to get through all of this. Sometimes I think you all think you are the commission. I don't know, but that's how it sounds. But we have dealt with the police, and yes, it's been corrupt. You seem to forget when you all are talking and trying to protect these police or not want to hurt their feelings or whatever the hell you're doing. There was a woman killed 3.5 years ago. And we couldn't get nothing. Those of us that were trying to find out and see what happened. We couldn't get anything. It was under investigation, so you couldn't get anything. When I talked to the police chief at that time, it was Chief Cito, he couldn't talk because there was an investigation. So he couldn't get anything. So that's why the community got up in arms and asked for this. And I've said this before, but I'm gonna say it again, that we asked for this commission. And before we got the commission, we had to have a task force to set up the commission, which to me is, I don't know what that is, because I don't work for the city. But how are we going, and that police officer that did that act was found, he was acquitted and he's still working. So we don't feel comfortable with that, but he's there. So how are we going to build up all this trust so that we can give it to the commission and know that we're going to be protected? I mean, how do you think all that's going to happen without the police? They're not going to be happy, but we're not worried about them not being happy. That's why we got this going. It's not for them to be happy. It's to help the community so they can get some justice. So I just want you all to try to keep that in mind. This is about getting some justice. It's not to protect your police. They got all the justice in the world when Ora Rosser got killed, and they had all kinds of reasons why all that happened. So how am I, if something happens, and I've been arrested before, and I've shared that with you all, but how am I, if something happens to me or one of my grandchildren or even one of my children, how are we supposed to feel that we can come before a commission that supposedly you can get this information from, that we know you probably aren't going to get the whole truth? You'll get part of it, but not the whole truth. I'm saying all this because I want you to keep this in your mind when you're doing all this, because none of you have been arrested. You don't know what it's like. You're only going by what we're saying to you, and you're politely giving us all 10 minutes to talk to you about it, which to me is an insult. We shouldn't have a time limit. You don't spend an hour and I don't know how many minutes talking about this shit, but we get 10 minutes. How does that make the community feel that we're a part of this when you give us 10 minutes? It makes me feel like we'll hear a little bit of you, but we don't want to hear all of what you got to say. And you're only here because of us, because we demanded this. But you push us to the side, and that's not fair. I don't feel it's fair, and I'm speaking for me and not the whole community, but it's not fair. We should be able to talk as long as you talk. I done sat here and listened to you go through all this and read it and tried to understand it, but you're going to cut us off. So that just gives me a message and says, Shirley, we'll listen to a little bit, but we don't want to hear everything you all got to say because we're tired of all that. That's not involving your community. Just keep all that in mind.
Thank you. More comment?
Hello. Thanks for coming out tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear your views. I'm a resident of Ann Arbor. My name is Andre Watson, and normally I wouldn't get involved to the extent that I'm motivated to get involved in now. But Richard, I would really encourage you to, if the officers are feeling a little challenged but not offended, I think that would be appropriate for this climate and what we're trying to do. I don't think there's real teeth to abuse the officers with what we're asking, and I think you guys can go back and really find something more practical that to where you're not creating the environment I think Anna mentioned could be created. So discomfort, we're all learning how to live with, including myself. I actually moved here to Ann Arbor seeking something, and I'm still seeking that nice, good old, liberal environment. I really want it, intolerant and peaceful, humane. But I've learned that there's still a battle going on, and those of us, including myself, who are somewhat, not as aware because we've not had a lot of the experiences that some people have. I probably should have been more active. I thought the battle was over, naively. Yep, I get it. But as an African American, so when I consider my child being here, I need a healthy environment for him to stroll through after playing basketball, after coming from the library, after coming from a date. I need that, and feel a little guilty because I've not been as active before. So I would just challenge you to keep a healthy environment so that the officers are not harassed. They don't need to be harassed, but by all means, make them and keep them aware of the realities of, if you do wrong, somebody will kick you in the ass. There will be severe consequences, or go do it elsewhere. And then hopefully the other community could have the same policy that says what? Go do it where? Elsewhere. I think it's critical that we exercise that part of our democracy. And I think apathy or just believing that, because I used to believe, Rich, I was with you, man. Hey, I used to believe it was all good because nothing has happened to me. Last few years, I've learned if we don't exercise, and that's, as an outsider, that's one of the first things that I learned about Ann Arbor. Your history or the image of the city, it's refreshing and inviting for a lot of us. But we have to exercise our level of openness and equality and inclusion. We have to just do better. So if you're feeling a little uneasy about how to deal with that part with the officers, I'd say challenge them a little bit too to be as uncomfortable as some of us are. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Shall we extend public comment? Task force? We're at 10 minutes, right?
Yes, we are.
We have a lot to do.
How many more people would like to speak?
3 more.
Okay, 3 more.
Yes, my name is Donald Johnson, and I've only lived here about 3 years, so I may not have all the figures that I need on this. But I'm assuming, first of all, that our police officers are among the best paid in the state. Is that an unfair assumption? I'm assuming that per capita, we have a pretty good ratio, a pretty high ratio of police officers per capita. That's not true?
No, that's not
Very
true.
low.
Very low, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, I'm glad to hear
I
that.
think they're well paid comparatively, but it's
Okay,
very low
I'm-
ratio per capita.
Okay, I'm actually glad to hear that,
Yeah.
because in my opinion is that we have too many policemen in this country because too few people can do the job. I'm a teacher, we have more teachers than we need because too many people can't do the job. We need to take the people that can do the job, and we need to focus on them. We need to involve them in these panel discussions, not just here, all the communities around here. I think we're probably have really good police officers because of all you. You people are very sincere. I really believe in you. But what about the other communities? You know, because we're drawing on them. We're sharing police officers. They don't all come from here. You know, it's a statewide thing. Are we doing what's right for the state of Michigan? You know, we're spending a lot of time and money on these police officers. I'm glad that we are. But our other places, do we care? Or do we want to keep them locked out of here? We want to create this little enclave. You stay out of here because we've got a really good thing going, and we're willing to pay it whatever it takes to keep it going. And see, that's my concern is what we're doing fair here.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hi.
Joey, do you want to come up so that you can speak immediately, please? Thank you.
I'm looking at page 11 here, initiation of review. And I really like that, the commission isn't going to ask about immigration status. I also want to think about the commission not requiring that a person reveal their legal identity. I know a lot of people, like trans folks and people who go by, names other than what's on their legal identity, that would be, uncomfortable to, they'd be uncomfortable filing a complaint if they knew that they had to do it under their legal name and to get that out. But so yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I just kind of wanted to remind you all of another incident that has happened, the incident in front of the Blind Pig, where there was a Facebook video, and then there was calls from the community to kind of learn more about that. And in getting more information in terms of the dash cam video that the police gave, that also came with a narrative, it's not only the collection of whatever evidence that might be had, but it's also the way that that gets filtered or manipulated. So it might not be just the direct doctoring of a video, which has happened in other instances in other cities, but it's the narrative that comes along with the delivery of that information that can also be very harmful in terms of how that evidence gets perceived and gets used by the commission. So that's something very important to consider as to why we want someone like a data ombudsman that would not provide that same narrative along with the evidence. Yeah.
I just want to go back to the complaint process for a minute. And I'm thinking a lot about the complainant, and I realize that I'm thinking about my experience handling sexual harassment complaints at the University of Michigan in the 80s. So I was thinking a lot when you were talking about the procedure, and I realize that this is the ordinance. It's not what's going to go out as public material. But two things I thought of is that, to be sure, when somebody files a complaint, that there's something there for that person that's really easy to read that will try to explain. Because these, this is so complicated. So I thought those things where there's a sequential chart, like if you do this, then this, really in a few words. But the other thing that occurred to me then was the idea that you have a phone number, let's say it's me, and I can read, here's a phone number. If I call this number or if I send an email, I can meet with a person who's trained to describe the process. And I can do that anonymously, and that at the end of that meeting or at any point in time, I have the right to decide what I want to do. And nothing's recorded about. That's how it used to work in the office, affirmative action office. I would just listen to people and then I'd give them, okay, here are your options. And they could walk out and not do anything, or they could follow through on it. So I just wonder, and that would also be helpful for people who maybe they don't read, maybe they're like me, they like to hear somebody say it to them. So I'm just thinking about that. And the other thing is Shirley and Andre expressed it more personally, but I just want to say that anybody that's reading any kind of history, or even this weekend in the New York Times about what happened to a woman who was sexually assaulted, you can't ask people to trust at all. You have to establish a commission that will be as effective as possible, which I do think you're trying to do. And then that commission, by their actions, and the police department and the city can earn trust. But trust should not be a word that's at all used in this setting, I don't think. So, okay, thank you.
Just a very, very brief point of information. I noticed everybody present, including task force members, affirming that we have a very low per capita police officer ratio to resident ratio. Does that include the U of M police officers? No, it doesn't.
Oh, it does.
How so?
I was just given a...
Thank you. So the Ann Arbor Police Department has had 124 sworn officers. If you do the division with the population of the city, it comes out to about 1.05 officers. If you add in the university police, there's about another 50-ish officers. So when you add those two together, you're in the 1.15 to 1.2 officers per 1,000 people range. While there is no precise standard, there are guidance documents out there that look somewhere for a city of our size to be about 1.67 officers. That's an average. The FBI and other agencies talk about 2 officers per 1,000 people, and then some of our larger cities are somewhere between 3 and 4. So even when the university police are factored in, it's still a very lean police presence throughout the community.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, last thing is just that the whole issue of the police knowing that people are going to be looking at their emails, their conversations, their reports, all of that stuff. Like, it's not even a question of, well, when I need medical records, I don't go to my doctor. I go to the medical records office. These are professionals who are trained to handle records confidentially. They don't need to inform the chief of police. When I'm getting your emails, it all reference this person. It doesn't say to the chief, you're corrupt. It says, this is a white supremacist police state. Let's get real, you know, and you're in charge of it. And we don't need your interpretation of the records. We just need records. We need a professional records person, not an ombudsman necessarily, a professional records handler. That's all. Thank you.
Nice.
And if there's a light, if there's a bright light, that prevents police violence as much as catches them. You gotta prevent it.
Okay.
So are we about to move on to the whole next section?
Wait.
Oh.
At the end. Thanks. Thanks, Rick.
I had a couple of comments. One was about the advocate, and I think it really would be a good idea if it could be specified that that could be either an official advocate or someone that the person brought themselves. I think that if I were thinking about initiating something, I'd feel more comfortable knowing that I could bring someone along. So I thought that would help. The other comment that I had was about the issue of an ombudsman being in the police force and taking things out. And one concern I had, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know this, but while I see that that would be coming from a position of wanting to protect a victim, I'm a little concerned that it would raise questions about what happened to that evidence or the documents when it's removed from the police department, and whether there could be accusations of it being tainted or changed, or what happened to it, and where it actually might actually hurt a case. So I don't know how that would be dealt with, but that was another concern.
Thank you.
It would be copies, is what you're saying?
Yeah, not the original.
Not the original.
I didn't realize I didn't copy anything.
Thank you. I come not as a member of the public, but as of Monday and Tuesday, I was asked by Rich and Lori to come and give some comments on any issues that might come up, and I'm happy to do that. Two that I might make initially. As I understand the choice of disclosure that you're talking about a complaint. Yes, I'm Stephen Postema. I'm the city attorney for Ann Arbor, and I'm happy to be here and talk to all of you. Yeah. The issue that has been raised, I think, is that at some point in the complaint process, there could be a choice so that the commission would actually know about a complaint about a named officer and make a choice through the complainant whether or not to turn that over to the police or not. That's my understanding of the document, that you could reach that point where there's a complaint against a named officer. And what I wanted to advise you all is that the collective bargaining agreement between the city and the police provides that complaints be disclosed to the named officer within 14 days, so that once a complaint that names an officer is received, it should be turned over to the police. And so it's not clear in the discussion whether that's changed, but that's really an issue. And when you look at why this would be so, is that the police actually have a proactive approach to complaints. You want to encourage complaints, and you want to encourage that they'll be investigated. For that reason also, any complaint that names an officer of criminal wrongdoing, you could not have a situation where even the complainant who would name that to the commission, that you could say, we're not going to pass this on to the police. You would now have information about a criminal allegation against the police. And to the extent that you're suggesting that could be a situation, I'd ask you to think about that again. Nor do you really want, as a commission, think hard about it. Would you want to be in a situation where you had information about a criminal action, and then it was not turned over or stopped, and something happened again? I don't think that you would want to be in that position. And I think that as a commission, as being part of the city, that would be a very serious issue.
I think we imagine a way that the commission could deal with the information in a way that, first of all, honors the complainant's own desire, right? So if the complainant said, I do not want this reported, that would be the complainant's right of their own information. And then that if it wanted to be anonymous, that then we can handle that in other ways that remain anonymous, that don't have anything to do with the complainant,
right,
via data reporting, et cetera.
What I'm telling you is that once you have the information about the officer, who the officer is.
So what if they didn't give us the officer's name?
That may be a different situation, but I'd have to look at it further about the complaint itself, because, and this comes to another point that this woman raised here, and that is the guarantee of anonymity. You also need to factor in, as I think we talked about several months ago, the Freedom of Information Act. And so people FOIA things all the time. And once you have all of your records will be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And so people can ask, they could ask, what are all the complaints you've gotten against the police this week? So once that happens, that triggers an obligation. Now, things are redacted through FOIA for privacy and so on, but the fact of the allegation probably could not be remain anonymous. That the fact of the complaint, who made it, maybe it would require further research, but that certainly would be another consideration. You don't want to promise somebody that their complaint's not going to be public when in fact somebody can FOIA it from the commission, and you would have the same obligation that you would be seeking for records. I mean, that's the warning that I have, and certainly in dealing with somebody, you don't want to overpromise somebody and something to somebody. So I just urge you to consider that again.
Thank you. Yeah, Rich.
So on that, I think it's a serious concern. The way we've got it worded right now is that, the complainant has a choice, except to the extent that it's legally required, that the commission is legally required to turn over. I mean, there may be times in which, once the commission gets information, even though the complainant says, I want to keep it secret, the commission is just legally obligated for public safety. I don't know, but I don't think we have to resolve that now, is what I'm saying, as long as we say the commission will do this to the extent that it can. But it is a serious issue. So far as the collective bargaining agreement is concerned, I think it's ambiguous. It says, upon substantiation of an allegation or complaint, but no case more than 14 calendar days after the receipt of an allegation or complaint, a supervisor shall inform the employee, da-da-da. Now, it doesn't say in no case more than 14 days after the receipt by whom of an allegation or complaint. It might be by the supervisor. It might be that even if there were this ombudsman, that 14 days would trigger the time. But it's also possible that even if the time is triggered, and I think what Stephen's saying is that it might be triggered by the commission receiving it, and that would be what the union would say. I don't know. But even if it's triggered by the union, I'm sorry, even if it's triggered by the commission receiving it, if the commission has the legal ability to keep the matter from the police department, it could say to the complainant, look, you have a choice. Either we have to pass this on to the police department, or there's not going to be any possibility of discipline. I mean, that's a possibility. Can I also just say a couple of other things? So far, I think Helen raised the question of anonymity. Yeah, if the complainant says, I have a complaint against a particular officer and I want there to be discipline, at some point the officer is going to know what the incident is. But the complainant is not necessarily the person who was involved in the incident, and the complainant can remain anonymous. It could be, it could be a friend or whatever. But I mean, ultimately, there's no way around it. If the complainant wants to pursue the matter with a possibility of discipline, the officer is going to have to know. And I just want to emphasize, I mean, I'm not saying trust the police not to be biased or anything like that. And the R. Rosser incident was mentioned. I think the commission should look into that and should look hard into the investigation. And I've read the retort to the report, which was written, which said, there are gaps in the investigation by the state police. There is bias, but destruction of evidence is a different thing. And I think I understand the concern. I think the answer is the commission should be vigilant to make sure that there is no destruction. But it's the ombudsman idea is an everyday disruption of the ability of the department to do its job, and for something that we have not seen here, which is leadership destroying or corrupting evidence. And as I said, it's not just a chief or an officer; it's the ethos of the whole department is to be vigilant about that.
Yeah. Wait. Sumi, Dwight, Dick?
Yeah. I personally feel it's really dangerous to base what we are going to set up, which is going to be not just for 5 years, 10 years, but maybe it might be there for the next 20, 30 years, based on our belief, whether the police department is biased or not, leadership is corrupt or not, leadership is honest or not. I don't think that's how democratic institutions are set up. I think that it's set up based on checks and balances. It really, the individual taking the spot should not matter. I mean, imagine if the United States was set up based on Obama and what happens when the next guy comes over, right? So you anything can change overnight. I mean, so I think we should just leave our own biases, and I know we keep bringing Mr. Jason Kitt into the scenario to kind of bolster that view, but who were his victims? I believe they were all white women, right? So
I believe they were all Asian women.
Oh, really? Okay. So maybe there is, it's not, I mean, African Americans have a different experience in this country, and I think to just generalize based on our beliefs or our privileges, I think is pretty dangerous. I would rather leave our beliefs about leadership and how the police department works aside and just pure checks and balances. Is it rigorous enough to stand up to a really bad person or not? That's what my test is.
Can I just say,
yeah.
Even taking that, I think that the answer then is that the commission has extensive authority to get information and to call the chief on the carpet, basically, to say, this is what you've given us, we don't buy it. I mean, yeah, we're talking about an aggressive commission that can ask hard questions. And if there are incompletenesses in the record or anything like that, what's happening here? Sure. I understand that leadership changes and all that, but that's the answer, to make sure that the commission is aggressive, understands its function is to question aggressively and to get information, and to demand responses.
Dwight?
Assuming you covered my main point, we're not looking at today, we're looking at the future as well as today. If we lose sight of that, then we're wasting my time, if not everybody else's time. I want to speak to the anonymity concern too. Try to do this as briefly as I can. I lived in a town before I came here that was built for only whites. It was in the charter that only whites could be there. We had to go all the way to Supreme Court before we could integrate it. When we did, almost all the whites left. So we're in this county that's 12%. This is in Burlington County, New Jersey, near Philadelphia. So we're in this town that's almost all black, but the county has only 12% black. So we're getting all kinds of border tickets every time we left that town to go into one of the white enclaves, each side. One day, I have a conference that I'm going to. I had to catch an airplane. I see a cop when I pass him. I come back, and I've got on the speed control. So I knew where he was. This gentleman stops me and says I'm speeding. I said, how could I be speeding when I had the speed control on and I saw you from jump? There was no way I was going to get a ticket. So he says, well, I've stopped you. I had to do something. So I'm going to give you a ticket for not wearing your seatbelt. I said, the last time I didn't wear my seatbelt was about then 30 years ago. And he said, well, I have to give you something. And my wife said, well, what are we going to do? I said, I'm going to take the ticket. I'll whip you when we go to court. Simple as that. Because I wasn't going to miss that plane for this idiot. So I'm at the conference. It's in Chicago. One of my sons gets 3 tickets while driving while black in 24 daggum hours. He gets one crossing to the south and another coming back when he crossed to the town in the south. Then he gets one the same place I got one. Now, I did not file anything against that cop. If I had to do over again, I would have. And I might have filed it anonymously, simply because I wanted a record that he had done it. You understand what I'm saying? I wanted a record that he had done it. If I had done that, this is hindsight, if I had done that and it was the same one who got my son, then we'd have had two records. Am I right or am I wrong? Now, I went all the way to I called a congressperson, and we went and met with the prosecuting attorney and the sheriff, and I said things that people don't usually hear someone like me say. But don't mess with my boy. And that's what happened. Because when I came home, he was crying because he was afraid to drive. He was crying because he was afraid to drive. We can't discount the value of anonymity when we are putting a record down for someone. Because one of the main, I'm not somebody who's in love with data, but I do like to know how many times someone has been reported for misconduct. So I'm supporting the anonymity, and what my friend here said about checks and balances, it is essential. You cannot look at how you perceive things to be at this present time because you don't know how they're going to be in the future. And just because you don't know what's been happening don't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it. The checks and balances, being able to know and keep records, that's what we're about. And I'm not pointing a finger at anybody other than me for not reporting that cop.
So, if it's actually true that the commission cannot receive complaints without reporting them, according to the CBA, I mean, that's a very serious issue. And that's something that would have to be totally explicit. If that's what he's saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. Dick
Dick
had a turn.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you, I was in the bathroom.
No, she was calling me. I think we.
I wasn't here.
We are trying, and you've asked us to create a commission that is a safe, protected place where people can go to file complaints. Because there is a sense that the police department may not be that place. And that part of what we've done is to try to do that. We've now heard, really for the first time from the city attorney, that there may be an exception to that. And what he's framing it as, and what we have to consider, is two sort of different situations. Someone comes to the commission because they're not comfortable going to the police and say, I was raped. And then we have to decide, or we have to have a rule and say, if you give us the name of the police officer, we must, because it's a crime, give it to the police. And so before you do that, we want you to make a decision as to whether or not you want to come forward or not. So that's one thing that we have to, what's been put on the table. I don't know the answer to that other than that's been raised. If, on the other hand, it is someone comes and says the police officer was verbally abusive to me, and may or may not give us their name, I would try to look at and I haven't looked at the collective bargaining agreement, and say what they may be talking about are complaints made to the police department, not complaints made to another commission that do not involve a crime. And so if that's possible to do, we would have created at least a wider area in which people could come, give us the name, whether it's anonymous or confidential, but they don't want it disclosed at that point in time, and we may not have to tell the police about it. But I am concerned about the criminal piece, because I understand what they're saying, and I understand that it may be critical, because you don't want, I mean, this city had, a number of years ago, somebody that was going around raping woman after woman after woman. And the whole city was up in arms about it, and we did some bad things as a result of that. I would want the police department to have all of the information that they could but I'd like the person making the complaint to be able to make that decision. And the commission would say to them, once you've told us that you're complaining about a crime, stop. We want to tell you what your options are.
Great, and I am with you on that process, and I think what we need to do then is be really explicit about, and really know what is allowed and what needs to be reported and what and how many days. Like, we need to know that and make sure it's really explicit in here so that the commission is prepared to inform correctly. Because again, like, I do agree that if we're giving them the false information when they report their claim about what we can do with it or what we don't have to report about it, then that's a real issue.
Can I just add, I think it's going to be very hard for us to be absolutely clear about it. It's going to be hard in any given situation to say, does the commission have an obligation to report this? I think the best we can do is to, the way it's worded now is it says it's the complainant's choice to the extent permitted by law. And then the commission is going to have to decide in a given case. The commission is going to have to decide in a given case what the law requires. It's just it's a difficult matter for us to determine at this point. In this case, does the commission have to report even though the individual doesn't want to or not? I mean, law.
But before they complain, they need to know that. Because what if they don't want it reported and then they find out that you have to do it anyway because you decided it was law?
I mean, as Dick says, I mean, you possibly could have something saying don't name an officer at all, and maybe that.
So the only thing I'm saying is we should find out these intricacies and.
I don't know that we're going to be able to get definite answers, is what I'm saying. Law just doesn't always work that.
Well, we should definitely get them then, or we should challenge the CBA to give them to be more specific.
Lauren, what I'm saying is sometimes you don't know an answer until it's decided. That's
so you're going to tell the complainant, I know you said you didn't want this reported, but now that we found out we have to report it.
Well, no, what you have to tell the complainant is don't go further because there's a risk we may have to report.
So what I'm saying is we should be explicit about the risks and therefore the questions that should be asked and not should be.
Okay, I mean, I think we did say, explain the consequences, and one of those would be the consequences, including the possibility of required disclosure. I'm just saying at this point, I don't think we can come up with a catalog of when disclosure is going to have to be required and all that. And also, it's not that the collective bargaining agreement requires disclosure. The collective bargaining agreement just says if there's going to be discipline, things have to happen within such and such a period of time. Okay.
Okay, well then that's
totally
a different
matter.
matter.
That's a different matter. But it may be that the commission has an obligation of disclosure for purposes of public safety in particular cases. And that's,
well, I say we ask from the city that they tell us what that law is so that we can abide by it. Well, they make the laws, they should know what they are.
Well, the city doesn't make all the laws.
Whoever makes the law should tell us what the law is so we can abide by it. Or
so
fight it, rather fight it.
Haven't we said we're going to have independent counsel? Haven't we said that?
Yes. Yeah.
So why are we arguing over this right now? If we already said that, that's like. Excuse me.
I think if we're going to move ahead, I think we have to vote.
All right.
All right. I have one more comment. 3.1.5.1. There was a submission made by the community adding that clause that the AAPD cannot contact a complainant without going through the commission. So if someone submits a complaint to the commission, then the AAPD cannot contact that complainant without going through the commission. So they submitted that today.
I don't understand.
What is this?
What I don't understand is that the complainant has a right under the current procedure to tell us they don't want the police to know the name. How would the police contact them if they don't have the name?
Well, if it's a non-anonymous complaint, if someone submits it with their information.
The police can know about it.
But they're only submitting their name and whether or not they want it to be anonymous. So if they say, I don't need this to be anonymous, here's my information, that does not mean the police can then call them up and ask them questions or go meet with them. So that means the police have to, if the complaint came through the commission, the police have to go through the commission if they want to communicate with the complainant. That's what the insert.
I understand the idea, and it strikes me as a good one, but I'm just a little bit concerned about what if the complainant is also a witness in a potential criminal investigation, whether that would impair the police in conducting the criminal investigation. I'd love to hear from the chief about that. You understand? In other words, it may be that the police have a valid reason for talking. This is the person's the
They would
complainant.
tell the commission, this is why we'd like to talk to
Well,
the complainant. The commission would go to the complainant and say, this is why the police want to talk to you, and then the complainant could decide whether or not they want to.
I'd like to hear whether that would be to what extent that would impair investigation.
Before the chief, can you repeat the question so it's clear?
Yeah, so the question is, the proposal is to provide that if a complaint comes through the commission, even though the commission knows the person's name, the police department can't communicate with the complainant without going through the commission. And I understand the idea behind that. My only concern is that going to impair policing in the sense if the complainant is also a potential witness in an investigation, would that impair the police function?
I think there are all kinds of possibilities.
Can you come here, please?
It could, but
If it's not a concern to you, it's not.
So remember that criminal behavior by a police officer is generally not investigated by the Ann Arbor Police Department. They don't investigate themselves. It's investigated by the state police or another external agency. So in the event there is an allegation of sexual assault, which is a crime, it is going to be investigated independently outside of the Ann Arbor Police Department, so that the concern about the police going back to the person who is the victim, they're not investigating themselves if a police officer is the subject of the investigation. So I think we need to remember that. If there is a breach of policy where there's a complaint made, the hard question, which I think you've considered, is whether or not someone wants to disclose their identity. To the extent that they don't disclose it, I think you can say it's going to hamper the internal investigation for a non-criminal event involving a police officer. So it's a tough challenge to face. I think the discussion about non-retaliation, non-intimidation is very important. We need to work that in to the discussion, whether that is part of the ordinance or whether we look at both city policies or police department policies. It has to be very clearly stated that intimidation, harassment, and retaliation against people who report incidents is a violation of city policy, and you're subject to termination for that. So those are things I think that, as a part of this discussion that you've had this evening, we need to take back and work into the process. But I do want to reemphasize that the Ann Arbor Police Department on criminal matters do not investigate themselves.
The Michigan State Police do.
Generally, I think that's correct.
So the police, but it's the Michigan State, not Ann Arbor, that do the investigation.
The Ann Arbor Police Department does not investigate itself, though.
Right,
So,
but
yes.
still the police investigate the Ann Arbor Police. Thanks.
Lori, I have a question because, okay, we're saying that if the commission gets a complaint, the police cannot go to the people. And I'm not defending the police, I'm just asking this question. Suppose they have, the complaint comes from somebody else about the same incident that's not the complaint that's sent it to the commission. How are we going to dovetail those two things? They're investigating it, but it's not because of complaint the commission got. Somebody else filed something about the same incident. Somehow that came to the police, not through the commission. Because I'm like Dwight. I don't know if Dwight was one to say, how will they know complaints have gone to the commission in order to go out? But that's neither here. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking that if, for example, a person makes a complaint to the commission, and somebody else complains about that same incident, maybe directly to the police department, how are you going to dovetail when the police can talk to the person who has made that? Let me finish. Who has made that complaint to them if it's gone to the commission too? I mean, since we're throwing out all kinds of hypotheticals, I'm just curious.
My impression is that the suggestion is saying that simply any complainant that comes to the commission is coming to the commission for a reason, and therefore will be protected by the commission as the conduit for any police interaction. I don't know if there's a way, like if someone else brought it to the police and the commission didn't know about that and they had their direct communication, clearly that complainant is comfortable.
I'm just asking. We're throwing out what things could be possibly happening.
I'm just saying that I think this is just saying for things that are brought to the commission, this is an extra protection to that complainant. And that would be in and of itself worthwhile and important for the many circumstances in which it's only brought to the commission, right? Like there might be some of those circumstances and the police are having an interaction with the complainant that the commission isn't connected to at all, and the commission clearly doesn't have control over that interaction. But we can be supportive of the complainants who do come to the commission.
I'm not saying anything at all about those that come. That's clear. They cannot go to a complainant who has made a complaint through the commission.
Right.
No, not debatable, not saying that should not happen. I'm just saying, as long as we're looking at hypotheticals and all the different ways that things can be turned around and twisted, it was just a thought that occurred to me, that if a complaint is made someplace else, and this person happens to be part of what they're investigating, in essence, how do we protect that person when they brought something to the commission? So the commission is not faulted for this person now being spoken to when it didn't come from the commission. So.
You're looking for patterns. You're asking about how you can see patterns.
Anna?
Just thinking to your question about, I'm not sure we would be able to protect the complainant, but I believe we've talked about potentially having reports of like investigations that are happening so that at least we might be able to say to the, maybe either say or just have the information knowing that it's being investigated without that person's consent. Does that make sense?
No, but go ahead.
So we said that if we as a commission, if the commission was alerted to knowing what investigations were already happening that were not triggered by us or by the commission, then we may at least have more knowledge to know for that complainant that there is an investigation that's happening that could potentially impact them.
So the commission will have information about complaints that the police don't have, but the police won't have information about complaints that the commission has.
Yep. Okay. That's just something I believe we've talked about. I feel like it's been a long time, but
regular data draws or
yeah, exactly. So that it doesn't trigger things. Yeah, we just get a monthly report of what investigations are happening, and then we know.
You mean they know?
Sorry. The commission knows. I'm sorry.
I think it was Shirley who actually said. Sometimes she thinks the task force thinks they are the commission. So I'm just a real stickler for making sure that that separation stays in place. So.
Yeah. Is there
Can I ask one more question though while we're talking? Because at one point there was talk about whether or not information should come from the police chief. Somehow that morphed into whether or not the police should get information about complaints. And I'm not sure where that intersection happened and the discussion went off. So did I miss the part where there was a conclusion about the police chief thing, or that's not something that's going to be discussed, or it's been settled and I missed it? What?
Well, it hasn't been settled. It's written in the document, and we need to discuss what we're going to vote on, and then we need to vote.
Okay, because I think there was that lady somebody made the suggestion that maybe we should look at best practices from other commissions on how that happened. So is that where we are? We're going to be looking at other commissions to see how they handle it.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
I'll say. I mean, I've looked at a bunch of governing documents, and I've never heard of anything like this. So maybe there is something out there, but I haven't seen it. I know that DC was mentioned, District of Columbia, and in DC, the officer gets to, a complaint comes to the oversight body, and the officer gets to know about it within 7 days. So I am not aware of anything like.
No, I'm talking about getting information from the police chief, because it's kind of like we're making those two things synonymous.
Yeah.
Whether the commission gets information from the police chief, or whether the commission gives information to the police. Those are two different things in my mind.
Right. And I'm saying that I have never seen anything like where the oversight body gets information from an ombudsman.
Okay.
I'm not aware of anything like that. Okay.
So that's the
in terms of best practices, and that's it. I've looked at a lot of oversight bodies. I've never seen anything like it. Okay.
So I guess one question would be whether we feel we can adopt what we've covered tonight in Article 3, and if we want to make any conditions on it before it's finally adopted for any sort of more exploration and more research.
Yeah.
I'm open to other proposals about how we move through this.
I think, yeah, we have to move ahead. I mean, I've taken notes. Others might take notes in some on some ways that we've discussed of amending it, moving language all around. And I guess there was a sense of adding that language about protecting the complainant if from police contact. But I think we should adopt this in principle and move on. Leaving open the possibility of, we've always said nothing's final until it's all final.
Do we want to review the amendments to it? That,
well,
you've tracked some of them, right, Lauren? And Rich has tracked some.
Yeah.
Other people probably have.
I'll tell you what I have. I have first moving to the beginning of 3.3, the sentences on maintaining contact with the complainant and the advocate, and adding
the advocate being personal or professional?
And advocate personal or professional, yeah. It could be the choice of the complainant.
Before you go on,
yeah.
Just a process point. If these are going to be viewed as amendments to here,
yeah,
and they're raised as amendments, let's vote on them. And let's say whether we agree or not agree to add them to the
each one.
document so we can build on something, and ultimately we would have a document with amendments or not that we can then vote on in its entirety.
All right,
Okay.
I thought we'd sort of taken an informal vote on most of that,
Well,
or informal sense anyway. So.
How do we feel about the idea of voting on each amendment as it's raised?
I think that we should, so that we hear
track of
again,
it.
we keep track of it, so
Okay.
that we know what it is that we're voting
Should I
on.
present what I've got?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
and then anybody
All right,
else
yeah.
can chime in if you have.
Well, wait,
One at a time.
So the first one I got is to move the two sentences on maintaining contact.
Sorry, what page is this?
Well, that's from page 14. The second and third sentences of the first full paragraph. Those will be moved to the beginning of the section and adding
On
in.
page 12, letter B.
That's right. To the beginning of 3.1.3, adding in at the end of the first of those two sentences and the implications of every option in a process of continuous informed consent. And then the second sentence would be amended to provide that the complainant shall have the right to have the services of an advocate, either a personal one or the one recommended by the or retained by the commission.
Okay, so can we vote
so
on
that's
that?
what- yeah.
So it's a thumb vote. So it's either up, down, or sideways. Okay.
The second one I have is in the last full paragraph on page 13. The complaint form made available pursuant to 3.1.2 shall, and then add the language in ask only for a choice as to anonymity and shall, and then assure. So to make
Read that again. Say that again, please.
After the shall, in the
Yes.
second line of that paragraph, to add in ask only for a choice as to anonymity and shall.
Right here. So that's addressing the point made about simplifying the choice
Yeah.
at the very beginning of the process. And waiting to inform the complainant of the multitude of other choices when there's a meeting, but not on the form.
I'm so sorry, Rich, can you read that one more time?
Yeah, sure.
Just the words that you added.
Ask only for a choice as to anonymity and shall. The third one I've got
that's
is,
Wait, can we vote on that?
oh yeah, I'm sorry, sorry.
Okay, vote. Are you voting?
Yes, sorry.
The next one I've got is on, in 3.151. And by the way, I would suggest that we make that a separate, make that 3.1.6 and add number to everyone, not make that subordinate to the other. I mean, I know Lori squeezed it in there without changing numbers, but I'd suggest we just change the numbers. Page 16.
So the retaliation, protection against retaliation and intimidation.
And I don't know if you want to take a separate vote on renumbering, but I'm just going to suggest that to.
We don't
have to vote.
I don't think we have to vote on
renumbering. Okay. So before little a, any form of intimidation against any complaining witness or other person involved in the incident review process, comma, or conduct that could reasonably be perceived as retaliatory, comma, threatening, comma, or intimidating, comma.
Okay, based on Monica's point.
Yeah.
Okay, vote.
And the next one I have is, let me see if I can find, it would be to add in the language about, I don't have the language in front of me that TJW supplied, and I mean, I think it might pay to look at the language again for precision, but basically to protect the complainant against contact by the city, except through the commission. I'm not sure if that language is in.
Yeah, the language is written in the document we got today. It says, if AAPD, whether through the commission or another source, becomes aware of the nature of a complaint and or a complainant's identity, AAPD shall not seek out, question, speak with, or otherwise attempt to investigate or contact the complainant without first approaching the commission and obtaining the complainant's explicit, uncoerced consent.
Yeah, I think that probably should be clarified to make sure that it's addressing a complaint that comes through the commission.
Yes.
But
and so where would that go?
I would say that would go at the end of the protection against retaliation and intimidation section, and just say in addition and add that. But,
okay, so introduce the language.
Yeah.
Exactly from the suggestion.
Well, I mean, if
I'll
it's okay,
put it in there
task
like
force,
that.
I'd like to. I might want to look, fiddle with it a little bit just for form.
Under that formulation, can the commission say to the police, you cannot talk with the complainant of whom you know?
Well, that was my concern.
Is that the way the language reads, that the commission can be a block to the police?
Well, that was my concern. If there's a criminal.
Well, leave us that the criminal is a separate piece, at least for me.
Yeah.
I'm just concerned that once the police know, once the complainant says you can tell the police, I want the police to know, I want discipline to occur, and now the police want to talk to that to get both sides of the story. Yeah. Is this section aimed at saying the commission then is empowered to stop the police from talking to the complainant?
I'm not the drafter, but that's apparently.
It says after obtaining the explicit, uncoerced consent of the complainant, then the police can
But the
talk to
complainant can always refuse to talk. I'm just The complainant can always say no. Now,
But it's far more intimidating for the police to come to you.
Can you, I'd just like to finish. I'm just concerned, we're providing, we recognize the need for an advocate. We recognize the need for providing information. We recognize the consultation, and there is unlimited amount of opportunity for the complainant to talk with the commission and the advocate. The complainant can refuse. I'm only concerned that we're empowering the commission somehow to say, we will not let you talk to them. If the complainant says no, not so much from the commission, but from the advocate that they have, who's supposed to keep the complainant informed, I don't want the commission to step into that. I just don't. Because I think there's ample protection that we've provided with an advocate and information, and that you always have a right not to speak, to force the police to come through the commission.
I'm sorry, does the language give the commission a block, or just say that it's got to go through the commission? Is your
It just says it shall not seek out, question, speak with, or otherwise attempt to investigate or contact the complainant without first approaching the commission and obtaining the complainant's explicit, uncoerced consent. So literally just asking the commission if the complainant is comfortable with the police coming to investigate, speak, or question, and so the commission would go to the complainant and say, the police want to talk to you. Are you comfortable with that? Again, just another opportunity to get the consent of the complainant, and then the complainant says yes or no, and the commission does what.
So is this would be added to the advocate who's also there? I mean, this is another layer of protection that we're adding in?
Yes.
Okay.
And if the complainant says, no, I'm not comfortable, and the police need and want to do a thorough investigation that requires speaking with the complainant, then what does the commission do?
I mean, I assume that's a conversation, then the commission educates the complainant on what that implications are of that and what their options are, and again, the complainant can decide. Then maybe they don't want the investigation to go forward. That's up to them.
As I understand, the language doesn't give the commission a veto power. It just it treats the commission as a conduit.
The commission becomes another advocate
for
the complainant.
And it's only about complaints that have come through the commission.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's vote on that.
Okay.
I guess so.
That's
We
all.
have people not voting?
I voted.
Did you vote?
Yes.
We do.
It was two sideways and then all.
Oh, okay. Sorry, missed it. Any more?
Well, I just marked one thing. I mean, there's a suggestion about financial support, and I think that's not something we should be getting involved in at this.
You mean for the advocate?
No, for the complainant. Financial compensation. And I don't think that's something that we should be getting involved. I mean, I think that would raise a host of difficult issues, and it's coming in late. But I thought that we may want to say, we have language in 3.1.2, a provision will be made for persons who are visually impaired and for non-English speakers. We could say, or in any other way handicapping their ability to pursue a complaint, and leave it open to the commission to see what it can do to facilitate the complaint.
Yeah, I think the spirit.
Just broad, loose language, though, without getting into.
I heard the value in that comment as the value as being the widening of possibilities of obstacles that that civilians can face and might make more accommodation.
So that was just broad language.
Okay. Does everybody remember that?
Is this the one about the commission providing babysitting and
transportation?
Because I'm not hearing you giving language like you have on the other things.
Yeah. Oh no, I said it says provision will be made for persons who are visually impaired and for non-English speakers, and I just added, or in any other way handicapped in their ability to pursue a complaint.
Oh, okay.
That's just leave it general and commission.
And I think that under that, it's general enough to be ascribed to not being able to come to the commission, so or
I don't
not
think we
being
should
able to come at a certain time.
Or maybe, so for example, maybe the commissioners go to the complainant, stuff like that. Okay.
Okay, vote on that. All right, yes,
I just
Anna.
want to add that I personally do think it would be really great if there were some small funds that would be able to support people who are often harmed in the context that we're talking about, have little access to transportation or have or little access to childcare or whatever it is. I understand legally or in practice that may be challenging, but in terms of writing policy to endorse that, I support that. And then the implementation of it can be figured out later.
So are you wanting that to be in the supplementary report as an expanded recommendation for the commission?
No, because funding I think is going to be determined through this policy, right? And so if we don't, no, Dick?
No, I think that the commission, as I get it, the commission is going to decide what their work is and how they can best carry out their work. Do they need an administrator? Do they need a data collector? Do they need an investigator? Do they need funds to help complainants because we're not getting information? I think that once they do that, in consultation with the council, they're going to get allocated funds based on their work plan.
That's the resolution, that you have to have
And there is no work plan yet because they're going to do it. And that's why I think that these suggestions that the commission may consider in the report are helpful, but not to put it in the ordinance.
That was all I had.
That's a great recap. Does anyone have any other notes? Okay, so do we count that as voting for all of it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But
and then,
with the exception that we could do more research on certain topics.
Okay, and are there any task force members who want to take that on?
I will take that on.
Okay. All right. We have 10 minutes. I would really like to go to Article 4, which is on page 30. And we'll start with committees and assignments. This is under operations and support of the commission. The commission may create committees and it may assign functions to committees or to one or more individual members as it deems appropriate, provided that any report issued by the commission shall be approved by the commission as a whole. At all times, a committee or at least one member of the commission and an alternate shall be assigned to monitor newly filed complaints and acknowledge receipt to the complainant where possible, so that a member of the commission can ensure that an attempt to communicate promptly with the complainant, except in the case of a complaint filed anonymously, is made as provided in 3.3.3.
Probably be 3.1.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, is there any question about what that is explaining? It's basically saying, my understanding is that it's saying that we want to be, we want the commission to be responsive to complaints as they are made, and so that responsibility will fall on one or two members, and that will rotate. I mean, the commission has to figure out what that system is going to be, but that it doesn't require the whole commission to be responding as the complaints come in.
You want to vote on that?
Shall we vote on that?
Yes. just a little flea speck stuff. I think we have acknowledged its receipt, but before it's complaints in plural. So I'd just suggest deleting the its, so it just acknowledge receipt to the complainant, capital C, complainant, where possible. So just those corrections, because we have complainant capitalized throughout.
I mean, in theory, before we vote, we want to hear public comment on this. So can we move through it?
Yeah.
All right, 4.2, which is at the top of page 31, meetings. The commission shall meet at least once every month. Month is in brackets. Meetings shall be held openly except to the extent necessary to preserve the confidentiality of information or when a complaint filed under seal is being discussed. So I think the recommendation of the task force members who focused on Article 4 was to keep it as a month. And that seems to be a common practice.
Is there any reason to just like let the commission decide when and how they want to meet on their own instead of naming it once a month for them?
Well, that's a minimum. So it'd be saying you can't go off 3 months. So we expect you to meet at least once every month. I mean, obviously we could make it otherwise. I suggest in my comment, Terry, that there'll be sufficient work, with just sort of general policy stuff and all that requirement. But we can change that if you think,
Please,
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Noting your question, Lauren, okay?
I mean, I'm comfortable with the answer. I just was curious.
Section 4.3, facilities and staff support. The city shall provide the commission with suitable facilities for the conduct of its meetings and other business. The city shall also provide the commission with the services of an administrative liaison to assist with logistical matters, such as posting the schedule of meetings and ensuring that they are properly recorded. The commission may secure the services of such additional personnel for assistance as in its discretion it deems appropriate. Such personnel may include, without limitation, in addition to counsel, as provided in section 4.4, one or more of the following: additional logistical staff support, a researcher, an investigator, consultants, and meeting facilitators. Such services shall be provided on a part-time contractual basis. The city administrator or a designee shall ensure that such contracts are properly entered into in compliance with the charter and the city procurement policies, and maintained with respect to such matters as payment, tax withholding and reporting, and record keeping for freedom of information purposes, but neither the city administrator nor any of the city officers shall participate or attempt to limit the choice of or attempt to exercise supervisory control over such personnel. 4.4, council. It is crucial for the functional independence and thus for the success of the commission that it has its own legal counsel. The commission shall therefore select one or more attorneys to advise it on a continuing basis. .5 on page 32, budget. The city shall appropriate each year for the use of the commission no less than, and 2 is in brackets, 0.2% of the amount appropriated in that year for the AAPD. Any unexpended funds shall be held in reserve for the purpose of contracting for periodic extensive outside audits of the operations of the AAPD.
When we added the comments, it wasn't my understanding that the language, you wanted us just changing the language, so we didn't, but it is, in the, what we realized later was that it was in the resolution that there can't be a budget before a work plan. So our final thought was to strike this entirely and put in the language of the resolution or something like that that notes that we can't create or claim a budget until we have a work plan.
What did you say?
A work plan.
Work plan.
Yeah.
So,
Or the commission cannot until it has work plan.
Okay.
well, I just wonder, I mean, that does leave it to the yearly budgetary process then to decide how much is going to be accepted. This did say no less than a given percentage. And if that's relatively modest, I mean, you can say, well, you know, the work plan could require more. I mean, this is just meant to give a guarantee. If this is adopted as an ordinance, that would be more difficult for City Council not to fund the commission adequately. It's also a provision that is adopted. I mean, it's similar to one that's adopted in some other commissions elsewhere. Yeah.
We were responding to what we learned later about the resolution. If the wisdom of the group thinks that we ought to claim some money up front, then or the commission ought to identify some amount up front, you know, that's certainly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been talking a lot. Go for it.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, like, I definitely support putting something in there, and I know that in the TJW template, I think they put 1.1% of the budget, and I've investigated that a little bit, and that's like really pretty, actually at mid to low range average for cities like ours. Like, for instance, Berkeley has 1.17% of the budget, and they have 3 full-time employees for their commission. So I think that it wouldn't be too much to ask. Like, if we wanted to align ourselves more with like similar size and similar cities, we like asking for 1.1% would be like totally doable or totally in line with other cities.
Other comments?
Oh, yeah. So one question that came up was that in the part in parentheses where it says that any unexpected funds shall be held in reserve for the purpose of contracting for periodic extensive outside audits of the operations of the AAPD, there was some concern about the money being targeted or designated so that funds that would be needed someplace else couldn't because they were designated for this particular purpose. So there was a desire for some discussion among the task force about that.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that this is a guarantee of funding. It states a minimum, not a maximum. We could acknowledge the need, you know, that it will be based on the work plan and submitted to council like everybody else does. Add that language. And we could say, make a reference to the budgets of similar size forces and communities.
And then also not commit the funds.
And then not commit the funds.
So the bracketed sentence was put in there just to throw out the idea as a possibility, but should we just delete that sentence?
So there's no problem with the idea of unexpected funds being held in reserve.
Yeah.
Just the reserve is, yes. Just the reserve is then targeted. If it's designated, then the commission can't best use the money where it needs.
Oh, you're saying it should be reserved for the commission's use? For the commission's use, not?
Yes. As opposed to designated for outside audits.
Okay. Yeah.
Nice.
Wait, hold on. Dick?
I mean, I do think that if part of what we're trying to do is to be independent, part of that is an independent council, and part of that is what you can do with the budget. So I'm not opposed to it in the sense that it's a recognition that this work needs to be done, and the city is committing to it. What I don't know is whether there's any other entity within the city that is guaranteed an annual amount of money, I just don't know the answer to that. I don't know,
Yeah, I mean,
I think DDA, I mean the TIF capture and also LDFA, it's TIF capture.
You
I
get a
mean,
percentage of some revenue?
yeah, the incremental tax capture in the downtown footprint area, and yeah, LDFA, whatever it doesn't spend, it's in the fund balance, and then the next year. So hypothetically, if you don't spend an X amount, it stays in the fund balance.
I think the question is about having a minimum amount of money. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I do think the minimum amount of money is some indication of independence. And that is that the city council is committing that whether they like us or not, whether we're a pain in the butt or not,
It's not us,
commission.
remember?
It's the commission.
Thank you, for the commission. Yeah, I too fall into that trap. So, but I do agree with that. I was just looking, those are helpful examples. They help
So
me
your
out.
question was, is there any other city entity that gets a certain percentage of the budget?
Yeah, and now I have the answer to that. Yeah.
And can I just add, I mean, I do think this commission is different from other city bodies where you say, well, you know, the city, well, as you said, the commission might be regarded as a pain in the butt, and that's part of its function, and yet you want to make it hard for the city council to squeeze it out. So
it needs to have a budget. The Human Rights Commission has no budget at all. So when I was doing the research and traveling around trying to get us to this point, everything I spent came out my back pocket. And that's a problem. And whenever I would speak to someone else in another city about this, they would say, the Human Rights Commission in Ann Arbor has no budget, zero. It's like insane. If we're going to start it over, you know that we would not say we don't want a budget.
So I guess my question, I don't hear anybody saying they don't want a budget. I'm just trying to clarify, not for clarification, what I need to understand is what I heard Anna say, if I'm not mistaken, is that there's some place that says you have to have a work plan before you.
That's in the resolution, but what's the trajectory of the conversation has been, fine, you gotta have a work plan, but if we don't have some sort of guaranteed minimum amount on the budget, then.
So that doesn't matter about a work plan, at least for the, okay.
Yeah.
And then I would just add for the, like, you know, like you said, including some suggestive, like, also amount, right? Saying like 1.1% or something. It's like when it comes to negotiations, it's also a good thing to ask for what you want, because there might be negotiations down, so we can kind of like put our top negotiation out there. Like we would, this is our minimum, but what we'd really ask for and what other similar communities have is this much, right? And like that's just a good way to do negotiation, is just to present what you
I think that's
wanna
the
get.
perfect content for the report.
Yes.
Not for this.
Not for the
But this is
ordinance,
the-
but for the report,
Yeah.
correct.
So because the commission will be ultimately asking for, because I just want the city to be encouraged to give us a certain amount.
Yeah, I think we're operating, at least I'm operating a little bit in the dark here. Let's assume that this 0.2% is $50,000 a year, and I'm making up a number.
no, it's close. It's about
But
54,000.
it doesn't make any
Good
difference. It's $50,000. And the work plan that we submit is that the commission is going to go 3 times a year to Hawaii for conventions. And we put it in the, it's our budget. Now, assuming it comes to you, do we get it? Do we get it?
Pardon? No,
All
of
right.
course not.
So,
yeah.
so I'm trying to sort of reconcile the budget with somebody else approving some items. I mean, I'm not concerned so much about the Hawaii trips. On the other hand, I do think that city council is going to have some approval over the expenditure of money. So I'm trying to reconcile that to what does the guarantee mean? If we're guaranteed $50,000 a year, and we develop a work plan in order to get the work done, doesn't mean that we're going to get it, sue me.
Yeah, but I mean, I can also think of the LDFA had a placeholder for $750,000 with no work plan, and it passed through city council. I, of course, voted against it because it goes against what we believe in, but there was a council majority, just gave it to them. So I can also always give you counter examples of,
It's a matter of political will whether
Yeah, well, that's what I
somebody
said.
wants to hold people accountable or not. Yes.
Can I ask you, Sumi,
Ah.
what number you think would be plausible to put in there?
Oh, please don't ask.
Don't
me
ask
that.
you.
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't know
1.1
whether how many staff members we are going to. It could be 50,000. It could be 150. I don't want to go into a guessing game without actually.
I realize. I'm just wondering. I mean, if the idea here is that we're proposing an ordinance that would have a number.
I think it's enough to say, here's what other similar
Well, you
cities are
mentioned
doing.
one,
So
but 1.1 strikes me as very high. I hadn't seen one.
1.17 in Berkeley.
Of
Yeah,
the
but I
of
mean,
the
it's-
police
that's-
budget.
It's far higher than any other. I've
Is
seen.
it of the police budget or
Yeah.
the total city budget?
Oh, I'd have to double check on that. Yes, I think it's fine. I don't know.
As somebody who's been dependent for my entire professional career on grant sources, what about, can you break it down into A and B? And A is source of funding, and it's a guaranteed source of funding. B is the budget, and then in the budget you say, of course, we will, we'll submit a work plan. But it seems to me what you're really talking about is in order for this commission to be effective, it has to have a dependable source of funding. And you're saying at the least.
Yeah.
So then that's all you have to agree on for that part. And why shouldn't the
point.
city
Good
fund
point.
it?
Yeah.
So
Why
you're saying that rather than title it budget, title it source of funding?
Yeah, or have A is source of funding and B is budget. And then in
Good point.
budget part, you express that you understand that you're going to have to submit a budget and it'll be approved, or it won't be approved. So you're just making it linguistically more of a shared meaning.
Okay, so I want to point out that it is after 10 o'clock. We are allowed to continue, but out of respect to everyone's time, do we want to stop now, or do we want to go to the end of Article 4?
Well, why don't we get to where we can adopt these? Which we haven't done.
But
So-
you can't adopt it until you have public comment.
Yeah, so
And
in
the
order
last
to
public
adopt
comment
it,
took 45 minutes.
Well, hopefully.
I'm just saying.
I'm saying hopefully there won't be
So,
that much.
is it, I mean, if we're gonna go another hour, can we like call it so we can all go to the bathroom? I haven't wanted to leave, and I think that that's something we need to start working into this.
If I can make a recommendation, I think you need to stop. There is some serious issues that need further discussion in this section that deal with what's specified in the city charter, the budgetary process, and some other matters. And I think if you stop now and wait till next time, they'll give you the opportunity to talk to the city attorney, the city administrator, and some others about some of the things that are in there. That is not a comment on my part as to the validity of the request. It is a comment as to the fact that there are some procedural issues that before you adopt this, probably ought to have a little bit of a conversation about.
Can you give us an example of how
Yeah.
maybe?
The city charter specifies procurement limits. There are city policies that deal with management of contracts. There are other authorities as well. So I think rather than proceed to a point where we're headed for some conflict, I think it's good to take a break and use the intervening week to talk a little bit about what's in there versus what is what are some hard no-goes.
So does that impact 4.1 through 4.4?
It does.
it doesn't impact 4.1 or 4.2. I think you're referencing 4.3.
Budget.
Right, budget, right. Actually, that's 4.5.
And I guess I mean, we added language in compliance with the charter and city procurement policies in response to that concern. So I'm not sure why that's
I'll
not-
also, just to be straightforward with you, you have yet to really talk about the extent of commitment of commissioners that is needed to execute what's in this document. And I think that's also a good subject to have some conversation about before you go any further.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I don't believe that you have really adequately addressed the issue of what the time commitment is to do what is in this document and what that means for people who are going to serve on the commission and what that looks like. Because there has to be a recommendation as to that goes with what you're recommending in here, because from what I have heard, what you've asked for in here exceeds the perception that we're going to have a commission that meets once a month for a couple of hours. And to go beyond that, you're really asking for a pretty big commitment from community members who are going to serve on it.
So that was the minimum. We said once a month was the minimum. And there's a potential of putting in some full-time employees if we have the money for it. So we can discuss what personnel looks like.
Listen, what I'm hearing, we're getting ready to make the same mistake with the commission that they made with the task force, which was people had one impression of what the time commitment would be, and it has morphed into something different. I went on vacation and came back and found out why I was meeting for 3 hours on Thursday nights instead of 2. So, am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
No, I think it's a fair summary. Thank you.
Okay.
We have on the composition committee, which is really what you're talking about. We're talking about who should be on it, what qualifications, what's expected, which is your point.
I think so.
And that flowed to a large extent from people's experience on this task force. And what Monica is saying is that when people applied, there was no sense of what commitment you needed to make. You're suggesting, as you look at this, the commitment is sufficiently large that the pool is going to be so small as not to be represented.
I think you run that risk, and I think as you look at trying to engage a commission that is inclusive and broadly represents the community, particularly marginalized sections, people who have had, who don't have a history of positive relations with the police department. I think you're at a point where balancing expectations with requirements is something you really got to consider, because I think it'll impact people's willingness to serve on the commission without, if they get into it and they didn't have a good feel for what the time commitment is and whether or not the things that you've recommended can actually be done, because I don't know that we have a common understanding of what the commission commitments are going to look like.
Rich?
I mean, it obviously is a concern, and there's no way of knowing until it happens, but I think the provision 4.1 for committees and individual designations, I think should address a good deal of that. And look, we don't know how many complaints there will be. The number of complaints that the police force gets now is not that large. And presumably it'll be the commission, the existence of the commission will generate complaints. I mean, that's part of the reason it's there. But it can be a small member that do most of the work on those. And frankly, from my own experience with the university committee, many of the complaints did not take members very much time, because many of them can be handled. I mean, frankly, if you find out from the police what their view is, and you find out the complainant's view, very often it's just very cut and dried. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be an enormous commitment for all. It's no way of knowing until it happens. And as to say, as far as the charter and procurement policies, I think we've addressed that in 4.3.
Well, your question was whether or not we want to stop now and pick this up next time.
Yeah.
Is that still the question on the table?
That is still the question on the table.
Do we get to vote?
We get to vote.
Okay.
I would also just add that when you get late into the evening hours, the public is not well served by having discussions when people's patients have worn and you've lost a good bit of your audience.
Excellent point.
I think that the issues that you raise, Mr. Lazarus, are very valid, and they are things that we have considered, and we can consider them further. And I think that the task force needs to decide if we want to continue or if we want to stop. And I'm open to doing either.
It doesn't make any difference how you pose the question. Whether we continue or we stop, just vote.
Okay.
Just frame it either way.
I'm hearing a motion from Monica to adjourn.
You're not hearing anything from me. I
thought that was
don't
what
put
you
more
were
words in my mouth
Okay.
than I
I'm going to move that we adjourn, and therefore you can vote up and down.
Okay. Does everybody want to vote for that? Okay. We're adjourned.
All right.